Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to in-person hearings. It's good to see everyone. In order to provide our technical and digital staff with notice of the hearing start, I'm going to count down from 5 before calling the hearing officially to order. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Committee will now come to order. Today, the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology is holding a hearing entitled A Safe Wireless Future, Securing Our Networks and Supply Chain. Due to COVID-19 public health emergency, members can participate in today's hearing either in person or remotely via online video conferencing. Members who are not vaccinated and participating in person must wear a mask and be socially distanced. Such members may remove their mask when they are under recognition and speaking from a microphone. Staff and press who are not vaccinated and present in the committee room must wear masks at all times and be socially distanced. For members participating remotely, your microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Please note that once you unmute your microphone, anything that is said in Webex will be heard over the loudspeakers in the committee room and subject to be heard by live stream and C-SPAN. Since members are participating from different locations at today's hearing, all recognition of members, such as for questions, will be in the order of subcommittee seniority. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you to our witnesses, some of whom are here in person and some of whom are here on screens, just as some of our members are. This is a hybrid hearing, and in a way, it highlights the promise of new technologies to our country itself, even as we may resume many in-person activities. Advances in technology have brought us to this place and allowed us all to continue life as normally as possible over the past year plus. The pandemic made online work, education, civil engagement, and social interaction a norm and a requirement for large parts of society. Our telecommunication networks and the supply chains that feed those networks answered the increased demand and kept our nation connected. And while the pandemic is not over yet, it is clear that the need and demand for connectivity will just keep growing. The bipartisan work of this committee has laid the foundation for the nation's telecommunications networks to flourish. And to ensure that this continues, we look to foster innovation and competition, protect our networks and supply chains from threats by non-trusted actors, and provide the marketplace with a predictable, stable government, a government that is a partner as well as a regulator. So let's get to it. There are 9 bills before us, a Herculean effort, and nearly all of them are bipartisan. We can think of them as loosely falling into 3 categories. 3 could be considered bills to keep the public, smaller providers, and small businesses educated about how to protect their telecommunications networks and supply chains, and to provide support to them as they navigate the changing network and supply chain marketplaces. These are the Understanding Cybersecurity of Mobile Networks Act, the Open RAN Outreach Act, and the American Cybersecurity Literacy Act. The second group of bills that will lock in supportive government entities to ensure that our networks and supply chains remain safe. These are the Communications Security Advisory Act of 2021, the NTIA Policy and Cybersecurity Coordination Act, among others. And finally, the third set of bills will facilitate U.S. leadership with regard to what technologies come next and how we can leverage them to improve the lives of Americans in all corners of our nation. These are the Secure Equipment Act of 2021, the Information and Communication Technology Strategy Act, and the Future Networks Act. There's a lot packed into these proposals, and no doubt we will need to make changes to improve and clarify each of them. But I look forward to doing that with my friends and colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Let me take a moment to discuss the Future Networks Act, which is a bill I introduced along with my friends, Representatives McBath and Johnson. The Future Networks Act will require the Federal Communications Commission to create a 6G task force with members appointed by the chair and comprising representatives from trusted companies, public interest groups, and government representatives at every level of government, including tribes. The mandate of the task force would be to report on possible uses, strengths, and limitations of sixth-generation wireless technology, including any supply chain, cybersecurity, or other limitations that will need to be addressed as wireless technology evolves. Convening a broad group of key stakeholders in the early stages of 6G development will ensure continued U.S. leadership in the global economy. Congress can accelerate our success as a nation by opening the door to new ideas and inventions and fostering healthy competition here at home. Our job in this committee is to examine, nurture, and encourage those advances in technology and ensure that they are brought to bear in a manner that makes our lives better. And today's subcommittee hearing, I believe, will help us do just that. I am finished with my opening statement, and it gives me great pleasure now to yield to our ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much to my good friend, the chairman of the subcommittee, for holding today's hearing. Greatly appreciate our witnesses being here. It's great to see everybody in person again. It really is. So really great to be here to discuss the 9 pieces of legislation which aim to further improve the security of our nation's communication networks. Though we don't agree with our Democrat colleagues on every issue, I'm proud of our bipartisan record when it comes to securing our communication supply chain. Our leadership in 5G, 6G, and beyond depends on ensuring that all parts of our networks are secure and on having policies that encourage investment in wireless and innovative technologies in the United States. In April, this committee held a bipartisan hearing on supply chain security issues where there was a bipartisan agreement that we must maintain our global wireless leadership and prevent adversaries like China from threatening our economic and national security. Today, I'm pleased to see the bipartisan bills before us that would help advance these goals. As part of this effort, I'm working on legislation that requires the FCC to develop rules to stipulate the Commission may not certify or authorize any radio frequency devices that originates from the Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China. This would assist in the effort to help end the forced labor abuses that have come to light in that region by the Chinese Communist Party. While this legislation is not being considered today, I hope my colleagues will work with me to advance that legislation going forward. The bills before us today are just a few important concepts to promote the next generation of secure technologies. We must also acknowledge the advancements being made by companies in the United States in these areas. 5G technology opened our eyes to many new vulnerabilities that come with advanced technologies. And as these companies have already begun work on 6G, they're developing innovative solutions to network security. We must ensure that Congress and federal agencies are up to date on these developments and prepared to knock down any barriers that may arise. I'm pleased that we're continuing to build on this subcommittee's tradition of bipartisanship on issues of national security, and also thank my friends across the aisle for holding hearings on these bills. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I will now yield the balance of my time to my good friend and colleague, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Well, I thank the ranking member for yielding. I'm very pleased that my bill, H.R. 4029, the Team Telecom Act, is included in today's legislative hearing. This legislation is very straightforward. It simply codifies the existing executive branch process for performing national security reviews when requests are submitted to the FCC for provider services and when an applicant exceeds the foreign ownership threshold. This process includes an interagency working group composed of national security and law enforcement representatives that provide the FCC with a recommendation to either fully grant conditionally on mitigation, or deny the application based on their national security or law enforcement perspective. It's critically important that we equip the FCC with the tools necessary to protect America's telecommunications networks from foreign interference or manipulation. H.R. 4029 provides certainty and transparency to the Team Telecom review process that would protect our national security interests while providing foreign investors a straightforward application process that includes standardized application questions and a timely review and notification process. Having NTIA in charge of the coordinating efforts would also build on their interagency coordination role while preserving the subject matter expertise of appropriate national security and intelligence agencies that compose Team Telecom. And finally, I welcome any of my colleagues on the Democratic side to join me as a co-sponsor of this very common sense legislation. Thank you again for yielding, and I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing the feedback from our esteemed witness panel and continuing to work together to pass substantive bipartisan policies to maintain our strength and leadership in wireless innovation. With that, Mr. Chairman, we yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman. I'm glad we're having this hearing today because as we've watched wireless communication technologies and networks evolve, I'm concerned that our security technologies may not be keeping pace. Consumer demand is driving the growth of wireless devices that connect to the internet, while this country simultaneously faces increasing threats to our networks and supply chains. Vulnerable Internet of Things devices can be hijacked by bad actors, including foreign adversaries, to target other parts of the network infrastructure, and wireless networks can also be exposed to risk by their own network components. The risk has grown as foreign non-trusted companies have become major providers in the telecommunications supply chain, both here and around the world. Addressing risk to our own supply chain will take more than just industry or just government to solve. Congressional action is needed to help the industry fortify itself. Today, we are considering a fair number of bills, and I have co-sponsored almost all of them. Each bill does something different, but they all have a similar aim, which is to strengthen the nation, its consumers, and trusted companies we partner with against network and supply chain risk. First, I'm co-leading, along with Representatives Long, Spanberger, H.R. 4028, the Information and Communication Technology Strategy Act, which would direct the Secretary of Commerce to report on economic competitiveness of trusted vendors in the information and communication technology supply chain, identify which components or technologies are critical or vulnerable, and identify which components or technologies the U.S. networks cannot work without. Next, I'm co-sponsoring H.R. 3919, the Secure Equipment Act of 2021, with Representatives Eshoo and Scalise. This bill would prohibit the FCC from reviewing or approving applications from companies on the Commission's covered list as required under the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act. There are several other bills, all thoughtful products of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and I look forward to hearing more about them today. Representative Doyle's Future Network Act will ensure that we stay on top of policy considerations as wireless services continue to evolve. Representative O'Halloran's Open RAN Outreach Bill will help smaller providers stay competitive in the U.S. market by helping them consider their network options. Representative Kinzinger's Cybersecurity Literacy Act will empower families and businesses with information to keep their digital lives secure. And Representative Schrader's Communication Security Advisory Act will institutionalize an important public-private forum for sharing information and best practices. I'll let the other co-sponsors talk about the bills, but in general, the reason why I'm co-sponsoring these bills is because in one way or another, each one either supports our consumers and smaller providers by educating them about risks and threats while also encouraging competition and innovation, or pushes the country forward by fostering network security thought leadership with our agencies performing as much needed steady hand at the wheel. These are important initiatives and will help our country enter the age, not just of 5G, but of 6G and beyond, and do it safely and securely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mrs. Rogers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone. With the recent cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure and priorities to secure America's competitive edge from adversaries like China and Russia, it's crucial that we continue to bolster our economic success and global leadership. We do not want the Chinese Communist Party setting the standards for 5G and 6G. America must be at the forefront. It's our duty to find solutions to ensure a robust and secure supply chain for our communications networks. Today, I'm pleased that we're considering bipartisan legislation that builds on our past achievements to advance our economic and national security. We worked together to pass the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. And because we all agree that we need to stop our adversaries from placing their equipment on our networks. For communication networks, we've also taken concrete actions to facilitate and support the next wave of innovation, including Open RAN technology, to increase vendor diversity and strengthen American and allied companies. Now we must work together to strengthen our security of our networks as industry deploys advanced technologies. We have a slate of important legislation we're discussing today, including H.R. 4028, Mr. Long's ICT Strategy Act, which would direct NTIA to identify which components or technologies are crucial and possibly vulnerable in networks in the United States. NTIA would use this information to develop a whole-of-government strategy to ensure the economic competitiveness of trusted communication technology vendors. It is critical that we push back against Huawei and others who are undercutting the trusted supply chain. I will now yield to my colleague, Mr. Duncan, to talk about his bipartisan bill.
I thank the ranking member, and I first want to thank Chairman Dole for your efforts to bring bipartisan legislation forward. Your efforts are noted and appreciated. I want to speak in support of our bipartisan legislation, H.R. 4046, the NTIA Policy and Cybersecurity Coordination Act. Everyone knows that our nation's been under constant attack from cyber criminals, including state sponsors and multinational criminal cartels, who've used ransomware attacks against pipelines, hospitals, schools, local governments, and businesses of every shape and size. We must coordinate our policy responses across federal government to protect our people in a coordinated way. So our bill will allow the NTIA to build on their multi-stakeholder policy development expertise to act as a central clearinghouse for cybersecurity policy development to respond to and prevent these attacks from succeeding. This bill codifies the existing Office of Policy Analysis and Development and allows them to continue current functions. We then rebrand the office to elevate the cybersecurity focus and expand the cybersecurity policy development role of that office to play a coordinating function all across federal government. So I want to also thank my original co-sponsors, Susan Wild of Pennsylvania and John Curtis of Utah, for their bipartisan support. And I ask the whole committee to support this important legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say thank you again for today's hearing. I appreciate you bringing forward these bipartisan bills on an important subject and look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. The gentlelady yields back. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Mr. Dalip Srihari, Senior Policy Counsel, Access Partnership, welcome. Mr. Jason Boswell, Head of Security Network Product Solutions, Ericsson, welcome. Mr. Dean Brenner, SVP, Senior Vice President, Spectrum Strategy and Tech Policy, Qualcomm Incorporated, welcome. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Cleet Johnson. I love that first name, Cleet Johnson. Must have been a baseball player in your family, huh? Senior Fellow, Strategic Technologies Program Center for Strategic and International Studies. We want to thank our witnesses for joining us. We look forward to your testimony. The chair's going to recognize each witness for 5 minutes. Now, if you go over 5 minutes, a trap door opens beneath your chair and you'll never be heard from again. This particular subcommittee, are sticklers for not only our witnesses, but especially our members on both sides of the aisle, adhering to the 5-minute rule and not to ask questions with 3 seconds left that causes the witness to talk 2 more minutes. So with those admonitions, we will get started and we will recognize Mr. Srihari for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, members of the subcommittee. My name is Dalip Srihari, and I am Senior Policy Counsel at Access Partnership, a global tech policy consulting firm. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today in person. I'm very honored to be here today. My statement this morning will focus on three general topic areas. First, the promise of open network architectures, including Open RAN. Second, maintaining and promoting U.S. technological leadership. And third, ensuring that NTIA and the FCC are well positioned to meet heightened expectations regarding network supply chain security. First, on open networks. Open networks enable the disaggregation of traditional network infrastructure elements, such as the base station in a radio access network, or RAN, into sub-elements and functions. This enables interoperability between products and vendors and thus increases competition. The global RAN infrastructure market has been dominated by a handful of companies, but the move towards Open RAN is unlocking the market and enabling new entrants, especially American companies who lead in software. To keep things moving, Congress should do several things. First, fund the USA Telecom Act. The House should provide at least $1.5 billion for the USA Telecom Domestic Fund, $500 million for the Multilateral Fund, consistent with the Senate's approach. Second, support both public and private sector testbeds to help build greater confidence among U.S. operators, even as the technology is already being deployed today. Third, provide support for companies, especially small companies, to participate in relevant standards organizations. Fourth, promote outreach and education for smaller and rural operators, building on the Open RAN showcase that Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel is hosting in 2 weeks. Finally, Congress as a whole should streamline access to funding for U.S. Open RAN vendors competing for business overseas. The competition is fierce, and some of the foreign vendors benefit from massive subsidies and other non-competitive advantages. My second topic is maintaining U.S. leadership in next-generation technology. One of the best ways to strengthen the supply chains of U.S. networks is to ensure that the domestic ICT industry continues to lead the world. On 6G, the EU is supporting a consortium whose explicit purpose is to put Europe at the forefront of research and development in 6G. There's also little doubt that China intends to seek leadership in this space. Industry should ultimately be leading the way towards new standards, but early strategic partnerships could potentially prove beneficial. Congress should also begin regularly reinvesting a portion of spectrum auction revenue into telecom purposes. Since the 2012 Spectrum Act was enacted, the federal government has collected over $150 billion in gross proceeds from spectrum auctions. While it may be tough to look backward, Congress should plan ahead now for future reinvestment. Some have proposed a 10% rural dividend from spectrum auctions. It should be higher, but we also need a research dividend. Even 1% of auction proceeds over the past decade, which works out to roughly $1.5 billion, would have been significant, although we should now aim higher. Finally, my third topic is that this subcommittee needs to ensure that NTIA and the FCC are well organized and capable of carrying out their assignments in these areas. 6 of the 9 bills before you today would potentially add to or reconfigure NTIA's workload. The members of this subcommittee must ensure that NTIA has the capacity to execute on these additional functions. As I've explained in my written statement, the relevant staffing within NTIA is actually quite small, although the President is currently proposing some increases. Finally, this hearing illustrates that NTIA needs an administrator, given the growing importance of what it's being asked to do. Ideally, Congress should hear from NTIA itself on these issues, and the administrator position was vacant during the previous administration for far too long. You should urge the President to fill this vacancy. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. I look forward to answering your questions.
And with note that he left 50 seconds on the clock. Mr. Boswell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Lata, Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Member McMorris.
Would you check if your microphone's on?
It says it's red. Can you not hear me? Maybe a little bit closer?
Pull it a little closer to you.
Okay, let's try that. Is that better? Okay, shall I start over, please? Okay, I'll let the time, there we go. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Lata, Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to share Ericsson's views on secure and reliable wireless communications. We appreciate your ongoing focus on secure communications networks, which are a top priority for me, for Ericsson, and for our nation. Ericsson has focused on network security for decades, contributing to numerous technical committees and standards bodies, and establishing dedicated internal security organizations. As head of security for Network Product Solutions in Ericsson North America, I represent Ericsson in collaborative government efforts, including President Biden's INSTAC, the FCC's CISRIC, the DHS ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, and on the Executive Committee of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council, as well as many other initiatives. Since I last testified before Congress on March 4th, 2020, our society has learned the indispensable value of secure, reliable remote connectivity in every aspect of our lives. I know from my work at Ericsson and from my service on the INSTAC and on other bodies that the telecommunications industry as a whole has stepped up and excelled during this historic challenge. We are in a pivotal moment for the future of secure, reliable wireless communications, and we must not lose focus. 5G will accelerate innovation and deliver transformative benefits and will be the most secure network generation yet. And at this moment, we have an opportunity for the U.S. to set a global example across policy, technology, and standards. I want to share Ericsson's perspective on key priorities and action items which can help guide us. Ericsson serves customers in the U.S. and in more than 180 other countries with nearly 8,000 U.S. employees. While our global headquarters is in Sweden, a longtime U.S. partner and defense treaty ally, the U.S. is effectively our domestic market, as it is our largest market and it drives our global R&D investments. We have key operations here and maintain strategic partnerships with many U.S. companies, such as Qualcomm, NVIDIA, Intel, and Juniper. In fact, the vast majority of all active intelligent electronics for our radio systems, and even the silicon itself, which comes from Intel fabs, are sourced from U.S. companies. We are actively expanding our investment in U.S. manufacturing and jobs, opening a $100 million 5G smart factory in Texas last year and maintaining 4 U.S. R&D locations. We were also the first vendor to launch 5G across the U.S., and we are committed to helping close the digital divide in rural America. Ericsson recognizes that security is fundamental to the success of 5G networks and commits significant resources to ensure that networks are trustworthy, resilient, and secure by design. Across all of our facilities, Ericsson secures our own supply chain with tight quality controls, traceability, integrity checks, site audits, tests, and verifications. And years before the disruptions caused by COVID-19, we initiated a regionalization strategy for our supply chain to mitigate potential risks or regional disruptions, excuse me, and reduce our dependence on one supply site or vendor. Well before the attack on SolarWinds last year, all of Ericsson's software was subject to rigorous software development practices. The subcommittee can support our common goals of ensuring that U.S. telecommunications networks stay safe and secure in the following ways. First, pass, implement, and oversee legislation to promote wireless security. We commend you for developing and engaging with industry on the proposed legislation under discussion today, and we look forward to working with you on these bills and in future hearings such as this. Second, support actions to accelerate 5G deployment through increased spectrum access, streamlined small cell siting rules, and incentives for rural build-out, and by ensuring wireless and 5G infrastructure qualify for funding in any broadband infrastructure funding legislation. Third, continue to enable a secure and robust marketplace of trusted suppliers. It is critical to leverage strategic codependencies among the U.S. and its partners and allies and develop policies that foster a diverse, trusted global market of suppliers that deliver high-performing, secure, and energy-efficient network products to U.S. operators. Finally, continue to maintain a policy of technology neutrality. Ericsson heartily supports openness and the evolution toward open architectures, and that shift is taking place today within Ericsson and the industry without any government mandates or preferences. On behalf of Ericsson, I thank the subcommittee for its leadership in this area. I look forward to the work ahead, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Boswell. Mr. Brenner, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Dean Brenner, and I'm here today on behalf of Qualcomm, which was founded in the San Diego living room, but is now the world's leading supplier of chips, an entire modem RF system for smartphones, tablets, always connected laptops, cars, Wi-Fi access points, and more, and the world's leading inventor and licensor of new wireless technologies. We're working on 5G at a feverish pace. It's rolling out far more rapidly and broadly than any prior wireless technology. There are over 165 operators providing 5G in over 60 countries, and nearly 1,000 5G devices that have been announced, in development, or for sale using our modem RF system. Over 80 devices for 5G fixed wireless access use our solution too. Let me thank this subcommittee for enacting the emergency broadband benefit, which is providing discounted connectivity and equipment to over 3 million low-income households, and the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which will provide devices and connectivity to millions of K-12 students. COVID has made it clear that everyone must have a device and connectivity. It's essential that we solve the digital divide, a 50-state, urban, suburban, rural problem, especially for students and teachers, once and for all. Thank you also for years of collaboration over the key input we need for all of our technologies, spectrum. We don't just sit back and wait for new spectrum. Rather, our technical and standards work takes place in parallel with our spectrum initiatives so that when new spectrum is allocated, we can put it into chips quickly to get it right into the hands of consumers. When the FCC allocated the 6 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi and other technologies last year, we had chips using that band ready to go. Likewise, the FCC auctioned the C-band spectrum, and when it starts coming into use late this year, we'll have chips for the band. Now we're working on new versions of 5G with many enhancements, but also on spectrum initiatives to enable improved use of lower 37 gigahertz, 5.9 gigahertz, 60 gigahertz, and other bands too. American leadership in wireless depends on continuing technological innovation, but also freeing up a steady stream of more low, mid, and high band spectrum. Doing so requires continuing the close collaboration among this subcommittee, the FCC, NTIA, other policymakers, the wireless industry, and others, and that's what we plan to do. Let me provide Qualcomm's perspective on 3 key topics covered by the 9 bills in front of you today. The first is 5G security, which has always been a top priority for Qualcomm. Qualcomm works on 5G security internally with other companies and in 3GPP, which sets 5G standards. Also, for many years, Qualcomm has been an active participant and leader in CISRIC, the FCC's Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. In 2019, the chairman and ranking members of this subcommittee and the full committee asked then FCC Chairman Pai that CISRIC examine 5G security. Subsequently, one of Qualcomm's engineers, Dr. Farouk Khatibi, was appointed to lead the CISRIC working group on that issue. We look forward to continuing our leadership efforts in the next CISRIC. The second topic is Open RAN. Qualcomm is a leader in developing Open RAN, which allows a more diverse group of suppliers to provide innovative, reliable, secure, and trusted cellular infrastructure at lower cost. We're actively participating in industry efforts to advance an Open RAN ecosystem through research and development, standardization, testing, and security. We're working closely with operators and infrastructure manufacturers globally to help drive Open RAN deployments. This week, we announced the world's first 3GPP Release 16 5G Open RAN platform for small cells, which supports open and virtualized RAN, Open RAN for sub-6 gigahertz and millimeter wave bands to facilitate scalable and cost-effective 5G networks across all bands. Our new platform will help drive Open RAN with flexible and open architectures and power efficiency. We also announced a 5G distributed unit accelerator card, which is going to simplify the deployment of 5G virtual networks. The rapid deployment of Open RAN goes hand in hand with the increasing densification of wireless networks. Densification is accelerating sharply in 5G, especially in millimeter wave bands, which enable multi-gigabit, ultra-low latency, ultra-reliable communication, fulfilling 5G's true potential. That's why 43 companies around the world joined us this week to announce their support for 5G millimeter wave. Finally, the last topic is 6G. Even while working on enhancing 5G, we have begun to work on 6G in a very early research and development phase, and to work with NTIA and potential spectrum bands for testing. One focus will be on spectrum in the 7 to 24 gigahertz range for wide coverage. Identifying and freeing up such bands will be a multi-year effort. We're also working in industry groups that are beginning to discuss 6G. I'm quite confident that Qualcomm will lead the way on 6G. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brenner. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, members. I thank you for the opportunity to join you here in person. It's a delight. Having been in the policy trenches on communication security issues through many administrations and Congresses, I'm especially grateful for your bipartisan approach. In my work in the Senate, at the FCC, at Commerce, within the NSC, and now in private practice, I've been involved in nearly every cybersecurity policy development since the Bush administration. Through Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, the clear trajectory of cybersecurity policy is first, industry leadership, and second, industry partnership with a well-coordinated federal interagency. Successive Congresses and administrations have put the cornerstones of this approach in place, beginning with NIST's foundational cybersecurity framework and cyber threat information sharing legislation, and then since then, many more new laws and activities and initiatives at Commerce, CISA, and the FCC. These precedent-setting initiatives all promise to advance industry leadership and government-industry partnership for secure, reliable communications. Following recent attacks on SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, we are now entering a new phase. We must fully operationalize the foundational policies and partnerships developed over the past 15 years. I think the central question here is the crucial relationship between the ICT industry and the federal government. Will the future be prescriptive regulation or collaborative partnership? Today, I urge the subcommittee to consider exactly why the partnership will produce superior outcomes against the common threats we face. Government and industry must be on the same team to defend against the sophisticated adversaries that target all of us. As Mr. Boswell noted, the pandemic has shown that the ICT industry collectively constitutes our single greatest asset for secure, reliable connectivity. The ICT industry in the United States has the most sophisticated and well-resourced security operations in the world. During the unprecedented demands of the pandemic, when every single day was Mother's Day or New Year's Eve with regard to communications traffic, the ICT industry's core interest in maintaining connectivity was an indispensable imperative. It always is. This industry imperative not only fully aligns with the U.S. government's interest in network security, it's actually the foundation of defending that government interest. That's why in those harrowing months when our world changed completely, the FCC, CISA, and many others turned to network operators to keep our society functioning. This collaborative effort was not a regulatory mandate. Nobody told industry what they had to do. Instead, government officials were asking companies how the government could help them keep our society connected. It was a partnership that was as urgent as the life-saving and life-sustaining activities that depended on it. And it worked. This is the model for the future because U.S. network operators and their trusted suppliers are the U.S. government's most important partners in securing our nation's networks. Unlike other critical infrastructure sectors, the ICT industry has been working with the government on secure, reliable connectivity for decades, really going back to the height of the Cold War, when President Reagan, under the threat of nuclear weapons disrupting our communications capabilities, President Reagan established the predecessors of today's government-industry partnerships. Put simply, the ICT industry knows how to work with government to ensure the security and reliability of the nation's networks. Today's new challenges and opportunities call for deeper and more efficient partnerships to help network operators and their trusted suppliers defend the country. The ICT industry needs the government to advance these partnerships, especially with Commerce, the FCC, and CISA. They need coordinated processes that leverage industry strengths, minimize duplication and turf battles, and maximize coordination and impact. When I was at the FCC in 2015, the communications sector provided an innovative path to this goal with groundbreaking CISRIC recommendations for FCC-DHS partnership with network operators. It was a new paradigm. It was industry-led cooperation with government, perhaps an idea before its time as it got bogged down in FCC-DHS turf wars, but it's not too late to get this right. Given the maturation of interagency processes, the increasingly clear authorities of Commerce and CISA, and the FCC's recognition that its most meaningful role is in supporting the interagency, the time is now ripe for the U.S. government to work with the ICT industry to take big steps in securing our networks. The bills you're considering today can help us get there. I look forward to answering your questions, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. We've now concluded opening statements. We're going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I want to thank both Ranking Member Latta and McMorris Rogers for their brevity in their opening statements. Since I've recognized it to the panelists, it's only fair that you get some, that doesn't get you any extra time on your questions, but I just wanted to thank you. So I will start by taking 5 minutes for my questions. Mr. Brenner, you write that even as Qualcomm continues to work on enhancing 5G, you've also began to work on 6G in an early research and development phase, engage with NTIA regarding 6G, and are participating in industry groups to discuss the emerging standard. Tell me, how would a 6G task force at the FCC be useful to industry and to the country?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman Doyle, for your question. And I want to be very clear. We are in a very early phase of 5G. We have 2 versions of 5G that have been completed in the standards process. We're on our 3rd generation modem. We're working on the 3rd version, 4th version. So there's a long runway for 5G, but we work with tremendous urgency at Qualcomm. We're not holding our breath waiting for a task force. We're chugging along. So we have begun in an early phase to look at 6G, to begin working on it, and to get ready to start doing some early testing of it. So what I liked about your task force are 2 things. A, that it should be centered at the FCC. The FCC, at the end of the day, is going to have to allocate spectrum for 6G, and as I explained in my testimony, there isn't going to be 6G without spectrum, and the spectrum and technology interactions, that they've got to take place at a very early stage. So that was point 1. And then point 2, citing. So you in the bill, I noticed that one of the things that this task force would work on is citing. The 5G millimeter wave, which I referred to in my testimony, it delivers 5G 16 times faster than 5G in a lower band. So, you know, people all over the United States and all of your districts, they should get 5G millimeter wave. But to do that, we do need more sites, and it's never too early to have collaboration over where to put these sites so that states and localities don't just sort of wake up and say, oh my God, what is this 6G stuff?
Sure. Just to put it in perspective, as the world began preparing for 5G, what components of thought leadership were necessary, and how long did it take between the start of 5G development and 5G deployment?
Yeah, that's also a great question, and I can certainly remember when 5G was on a whiteboard, and that's how all of our technologies start. You know, there is and the other part of this is every government in the world wants their country to be the leader in 5G. You know, we're Qualcomm. As I said, we're based in San Diego, but we are a global company. We have offices everywhere. I have colleagues all over the world. So, you know, it is a 5, 6, 7, 8-year process to design, test, and get global consensus around a wireless technology, and then in parallel on our product side, get the chips ready to go so that when the spectrum is allocated and the standard is finished, the chips can roll out into consumers' hands.
Well, thank you. Mr. Boswell, as you may know, last week I introduced the Future Networks Act, along with Congressman Johnson and Congresswoman Macbeth. Do you support that bill, and would you share your views on the importance of focusing on 6G while we roll out 5G?
Thank you. As my colleague here.
Is your microphone on?
I'm sorry. Well, I'll get this microphone. It's been 15 months. Wow. It's this is like our new version of Skype and Teams mute button, I guess, now. But thankfully, if we had not already started on this race to 6G, frankly, we would already be behind. But industry has been investing heavily in this for quite a bit. Each cycle in a cellular generation is about 8 to 10 years. To give you a sense of how important 6G is to us at Ericsson, we are already hard at work on related research and testing to ensure a leadership position for the U.S. In addition to our own R&D, it's important to recognize different collaborative efforts, either with government or with others in the private sector. We're a founding member of the National Science Foundation RINGS program. That's the Resilient and Intelligent Next Generation Systems program, which seeks to accelerate research in areas with potentially significant impact on next-generation networking and computing. So that will be artificial intelligence, quantum computing, quantum cryptography, kilohertz spectrum, lots of different things that we will need to take advantage of 6G, not just make it go faster. There's also work we're doing with NSS, Platform for Advanced Wireless Research Program, and the ADAS NextG Alliance. All of these are very important to have private-public collaborative partnerships to help advance 6G, and America's already on that
And
path.
Mr. Boswell, I'll have to stop you there as my time has expired, and I want to set a
Thank you,
good
Chairman.
example for my colleagues. Chair now yields to the ranking member, Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Brenner, if I could start my questions with you. Qualcomm has participated in 3GPP virtually since its inception in the late 1990s. A decade later, contributions made in 3GPP by the U.S. and like-minded countries helped America lead in 4G deployment. Today, Qualcomm and other trusted companies are working in 3GPP to continue work on the 5G and now 6G standards. Would you speak about the role of the private sector and the role of government in making sure we're ready to lead in the 6G here in the United States? And it's kind of interesting that there's across the witnesses, and I think some of the questions you're going to hear today, is about that private-public partnership and working together and not having the heavy-handed government, I think, out there so you can all get out there and do what you need to do.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ranking Member Latta. And, you know, Qualcomm wouldn't exist if there were a heavy-handed government. We started our first technology in 2G, and there were 3 2G technologies. And fortunately, the FCC decided that they shouldn't pick the technology, let the market decide, and then our technology was able to lead the way into 3G, 4G, and 5G. So we're very attuned to this question of what the proper roles are. An FCC task force is not going to invent 6G. They're not going to design 6G technology. That's what we're going to do, not by ourselves, interacting with all of our partners all over the world, Ericsson, a zillion other companies. But what can government do? Well, our technology, as I explained, it can't get into the hands of a consumer without spectrum. Our technology, we can't make a chip unless the governments support the semiconductor industry. So, you know, again, for sites, you know, you can have the greatest phone in the world, but if there's not a base station that you can connect to, your phone is going to be, you know, unusable, or a Wi-Fi access point. So government has a clear role. It's in the areas of spectrum, siting, and then closely interacting with the private sector. We don't want 5G to be a surprise to the FCC. It hasn't been. The FCC participates in 3GPP. Other parts of the US government, NTIA, the Department of Transportation, the Defense Department, they all need to know what these technologies are as they're evolving and being standardized. So that's really how I see the differing roles between the private sector and the public sector.
Well, thank you. Mr. Johnson, you've worked on cybersecurity and supply chain issues in the communications industry across an array of roles in the federal government. There are a few bipartisan bills before us today, led by Republican members, that seek to improve policy coordination and communication with the private sector. Do these bills strike the appropriate balance for the public-private sector responsibilities?
Thank you, Congressman. As I said, I think this is the central big-picture question of this issue. And I do think that the bills before us, not to tick through each one, but they all have that partnership and the interagency coordination in mind. We've grown up quite a bit since cybersecurity policies sort of became an issue in, say, 2006, 2007. It was, at that point, DHS was brand new. The Commerce Department was not engaged in the same things that they're engaged in now, and the FCC's authorities were really, let's just put it bluntly, the FCC's relationship with the internet was a contentious issue. Now we have a much more clear understanding of who can do what and how, and most importantly, how they work together to maximize the industry's expertise, as Mr. Brenner said.
Well, let me follow up. Do you have any suggestions, in my last 51 seconds here, the chairman might have me drop through the floor, that we may consider strengthening the public-private partnership and advancing the U.S. communications security?
I think this committee has, and kudos to you for putting these bills forward. I think this committee's emphasis on the Commerce Department is very important, and its emphasis on the FCC's activities and pulling in industry, for instance, through the CISRIC, is critical. The Commerce Department is a really interesting agency of government, and you think about an NSC meeting where you have 20 or 30 different representatives of all the agencies of government, mostly security agencies, and then there's the guy or gal from the Commerce Department who's the only person there who works for the department whose core mission is advancing U.S. business and innovation. That's a crucial part of securing our networks, and that voice is a very important part of the security environment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, again, I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses. Your expertise is appreciated, and your willingness to work with us is also deeply appreciated. I want to talk about H.R. 4028 that I introduced along with Representatives Long and Spanberger. It's called the Information and Communications Technology Strategy Act, which you are considering today. It would require, among other things, the Commerce Secretary to submit a whole-of-government strategy to ensure competitiveness of trusted vendors in the United States. I think this bill is necessary to ensure that we're thinking about the future supply chain and what to do about the robust marketplace for communication equipment. So, Mr. Johnson, given your experience with the Federal Communication Commission, the Commerce Department, within the interagency process of the National Security Council, you have a very unique perspective into the security capabilities of the communication networks. Why is the Commerce Department the best agency to take lead on this work?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that, and I would like to acknowledge that one of the people that was core in building these foundations is your son, who was previously at the Defense Department, now an innovator in Silicon Valley. So he's part of this thriving ICT industry.
Well, thank you for raising that up.
But to follow up what I was saying before, the Commerce Department is unique in the government. You might say the Small Business Administration does similar work, but as a cabinet level agency, it's the only agency whose core purpose and whose employees wake up in the morning trying to promote business and innovation, both in the United States and through U.S. companies worldwide. So it has, and I think Secretary Raimondo has already taken this charge, it has a core role in promoting the digital economy, which is core to obviously to the cybersecurity, to promoting digital services through the International Trade Administration, of course, spectrum issues and other telecommunications and internet policy at NTIA and NIST is the world's experts in standards and technology. Bureau of Industry and Security is playing an increasing role in preventing untrusted suppliers from being part of our markets. So I think the Commerce Department is crucial as part of this team to go along with the FCC and DHS CISA.
Well, what are the special challenges then with the meeting whole of government strategy?
I think the challenge is, not to be too glib about it, the challenge is that humanity is stovepiped and territorial. And so you have to, in order to create true joint interagency teams, you have to get past that the sort of human weakness of people wanting to be in charge of things. Like I said,
the jurisdictional issues that we have here.
Yeah, so that's a big challenge. But I'll tell you what I do think has happened is in real world, and this is why I go back to the pandemic and also response to solar winds, response to Colonial Pipeline. Real world necessities drive improvements. And we've seen that through WannaCry 4 years ago, through the Iranian DDoS attacks on our banks 8 years ago. The real world activities force force officials and agencies to get things right. And I think we've seen a lot of maturation in those recent years.
Well, I want to ask about CISRIC, but I only have 1 minute left, so I want to move on to another question. Mr. Srihari, you draw a distinction in your testimony between Open RAN and open network architecture. Could you please elaborate on that a little bit? And I'll be sending questions for the record.
Sure. Well, Open RAN is a subset of open network architectures. Open network architectures refer to the concept of taking a traditional network element like a base station or a router, breaking it apart into its constituent pieces and connecting those pieces through common interfaces. RAN is just the radio access network, the part where your mobile device connects to the tower, but there's also the transport, the backhaul to get the signal from the tower back to the core central office, as well as the core. All of those things can be open and disaggregated. And so when I speak about open network architectures, what I really mean is disaggregating and enabling competition by breaking apart all of the pieces of the network from end to end, not just the radio access network piece on the edge.
So I appreciate the chairman's discipline on time, except when it's my turn to talk. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brenner, Qualcomm is a trusted company, plays a large role at international standard-setting bodies like 3GPP. There's been efforts by this committee and across Congress to enhance participation by U.S. companies in international standard-setting processes in order to push back against adversarial countries trying to impose their policies on the rest of the world. Mr. Brenner, what is the role played by Huawei in these bodies, and how does their participation impact the conversations?
Thank you for that question. It's actually a very complex question because of the fact that, we have, as a global leader in the wireless industry, we have interaction with every company in the wireless industry, including the company that you mentioned, and we have those interactions for a couple reasons. One is at the end of the process, we want to have Qualcomm chips get into smartphones and all those other devices I mentioned all over the world, including in China and other places where adversarial countries are based. We have a large group of employees who work in China too, and so we do need to make sure that a phone with a Qualcomm chip is going to work with infrastructure, no matter whether it's infrastructure made by whoever. On the other hand, in the standards process, it is usually a meritocracy. The best technical ideas through a consensus-driven process are usually the ones that prevail. However, the geopolitics does, enter into those things. There are times when when Huawei, we don't have, it's not like we have conflict with them over every single issue, and in fact, it's a vast minority of issues in 5G, for example, where Huawei may have a different view than we do. And what we have to do is, we don't have the option of just withdrawing and just taking our toys and going home. So we have to interact with companies all over the world and convince them that the ideas that we have are the best ones to make the technology the best.
Right, so important. Mr. Boswell, last October, Sweden enacted a 5G equipment sales ban against Chinese companies, Huawei and ZTE, following suit taken by actions in the United States to secure our networks from foreign bad actors. Just last week, the Stockholm Administrative Court upheld this action. Over the last several months, it's been reported that your CEO lobbied against this ban in Sweden, which runs counter to the actions taken by the United States to push allied countries to remove this equipment. Given the topic of today's hearing, I am concerned that Ericsson, one of the top trusted vendors in the United States, appears to be taking a different position on Huawei than the US government. How does Ericsson engage with Huawei when discussing cybersecurity or developing standards for equipment? And do you agree that Huawei equipment poses a national security threat in our networks?
Well, I can't speak for, and I'd like to point out I figured out the mute button thing, by the way, yes. But I can't speak for any government, foreign or domestic. I'm not a diplomat, I'm an engineer. My job is to secure networks, secure our solutions, and to secure U.S. infrastructure, frankly. We don't source anything from Huawei or ZTE, so I can't speak to specifics on that. As far as what Mr. Berner mentioned about standards bodies, of course, we work with dozens or even hundreds of companies across different standards organizations. But I'm afraid that's all I can comment on about that.
This committee has a history of working together, especially when it has come to enhancing our network security. We worked together to pass the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act to get Huawei out of our networks. And just last year, we worked to pass the U.S. Telecommunications Act to promote the development of Open RAN compatible technology. While Open RAN shows promise to increase vendor diversity, we also recognize it's a new concept. And so Mr. Boswell, I just would like you to comment on H.R. 4032. So that's the legislation before the committee, the Open RAN Outreach Act, which would establish a government office to provide technical assistance to smaller companies interested in deploying Open RAN compatible technologies. And what role do you think the government should play in the development of Open RAN?
Well, I only have about 8 seconds,
Yes.
I see here.
Yep.
So perhaps I'll submit an answer for the record for that, or I could continue.
Okay.
That'd be fine. You can submit it for the record.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes our first remote witness. Ms. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank our witnesses for participating and lending their expertise. My question is for Mr. Johnson. In addition to having the privilege of serving on this committee, I also serve on the Homeland Security Committee as chair of the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation Subcommittee. During the decade and a half that I've served in Congress, I've observed malicious cyber activity grow more sophisticated and more frequent. And effective defense requires a full court press. And there are appropriate roles and responsibilities for agencies across the federal enterprise. To defend critical infrastructure, PPD 21 directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to coordinate the overall federal effort to promote the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure in partnership with sector risk management agencies, which have more subject matter expertise. I want to make sure that the legislation we're considering today supports that important model because it prevents silos and stovepiping. Can you weigh in on the value of both DHS as a central coordinator for critical infrastructure protection and on the importance of sector risk management agencies? How should Congress continue to develop those roles and to ensure that the full capabilities of the federal enterprise are more effectively brought to bear and defend our critical infrastructure?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and that is, and I've also honor your service on the Homeland Security Committee. You've been a great leader on these issues for many years, and I think that's a core question. Just to lay out the PPD 21 process, DHS and now through CISA is what's called the sector-specific agency for the communication sector. It's also the sector-specific agency for the IT sector. And that is similar to how the Treasury Department is a sector-specific agency for financial services. It's not a regulator. The regulator in the space, in the communication sector is, of course, the FCC. There's not really a regulator for the IT sector, except to the extent that some of the IT sector's work feeds into the communication sector or through enforcement actions at the FTC. So that sector-specific agency, DHS and FCC relationship is absolutely crucial. And I know from my time at the FCC that a regulatory agency can either be a great enabler of that partnership, both between the sector-specific agency and the regulator, and between the government and industry, or it can altogether block it. And I think to answer Congresswoman Clark's question directly, it is crucial to have that sector-specific agency regulator and then contributing agencies like Commerce, I've mentioned NIST and NTIA, and even ITA and BIS. It's crucial to have those relationships crystallized, clear. Everybody knows what everybody is doing, and maybe as importantly, everybody knows what certain folks are not supposed to be doing. So that, and it's not about lanes, it's about a team. So I think it's, forgive me for the football metaphor, but football season is approaching, and every position needs to know its unique role and unique value add, and work together. And I think it starts with the sector-specific agency, but also includes the FCC and Commerce Department, as well as others like FBI and other IC elements.
Very well. Well, let me be the first to yield back major time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Scalise has joined us, and Steve, you are up next. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to be back in the committee in person, as well as Ranking Member Latta. I appreciate you having today's hearing and bringing up the piece of legislation that I drafted along with Congresswoman Eshoo, and I know she's here as well. I want to thank Congresswoman Eshoo for partnering with me on this important piece of legislation. Our bill, H.R. 3919, which is the Securing Equipment Act, stops the threat of China from infiltrating our networks by prohibiting the FCC from issuing equipment licenses to Chinese companies that are identified as national security threat. Not all companies, but companies that have made that distinction that the FCC is now identified as national security threats. In 2019, our committee worked in a bipartisan manner to help address the threat of China by passing the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act of 2019. That landmark act instructed the FCC to do a few things. Among those, publish a list of telecommunication equipment deemed to be a national security threat, prohibit the use of federal funds for purchasing equipment made by those companies, authorize funding for U.S. carriers to rip and replace equipment that was made by those companies. So earlier this year, the FCC did what they were instructed to do, and in fact, published this list. This is the first list that's come out. It lists 5 different companies that are on this national security threat list. Every company on this list has ties to the Chinese Communist Party, with the Chinese government having ownership in many of them. Clearly, you can see why that was a concern that the FCC identified. We also know all too well that the CCP wastes no opportunity to expose our vulnerabilities and to undermine our national security. While the 2019 law took a major step in getting compromised tech out of U.S. networks, U.S. carriers can still provide privately purchased equipment from these listed companies on the open market. So these companies can still sell to American companies where that data can be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Since all of those companies are subject to Chinese national security laws, at any point the Chinese government can choose to exploit them for espionage, tapping into their access in U.S. networks to gain critical information on individuals and sensitive government information. As we expand our 5G networks and heavy data flows and the critical technologies that rely on these networks, such as driverless cars and the Internet of Things, any existence of compromised technology poses a grave threat to our national security. Our bill seeks to further improve on the 2019 law. By prohibiting the FCC from issuing any equipment license to these companies, our bill adds an extra layer of security and puts a full stop to Chinese equipment from these threatening companies that are threats to our network. I look forward to having a full markup on this bill and moving it to the floor so we can better protect our networks. And I also want to ask, Mr. Chairman, I'll start with you, Mr. Johnson. As we look at the 2019 law that among other things, directed the FCC to create this list, which they now have done, these companies have had to do some things that are very, very alarming to be included on this national security threat list. When you look at this proposed legislation by myself and Congressman Eshoo, do you think this gives an extra layer of protection to the FCC? As we know, lawsuits are going to come, as lawsuits have come by companies from other protective measures that our committee has passed, so that the FCC has the ability to back up their actions, to back up this list by then following through and saying you're not going to be able to sell. Companies that are threats are not going to be able to sell in the United States these jeopardized products.
Thank you, Congressman. I really appreciate that question. And I think it has been noted, the cognitive dissonance of the ban on Huawei and ZTE for subsidized USF networks, but the legal availability of Huawei and ZTE everywhere else in the U.S. market has been noted.
And we see Huawei and ZTE challenging some of those laws as well.
And a note, the Fifth Circuit upheld the dismissal of Huawei's suit, I think last week. So probably on pretty sound legal ground as of now. Certainly a statute backing up the FCC's authority would bolster that authority. And especially for something that is this is a very profound power that the FCC would have through this. I love all my friends in the equipment authorization world, but it's a somewhat obscure radio frequency interference-based administrative law process. And so the power for the FCC to be able to block major companies altogether from the market is profound, and I think that underscores the importance of having fulsome processes from elsewhere in the government that feed into those designations, as has happened with the 5 companies that are mentioned first in the NTIA.
Thanks. And I know
Gentleman's
we're out
time
of
has
time,
expired.
so hopefully by passing the Securing Equipment Act, we can address this problem and others. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing us to come up. Yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. McEachin, who's joining us remotely. Yes, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your very fine leadership in calling today's hearing. Just to jump right on to it, Mr. Shari, again, thank you for your appearance today. We've already had a little bit of a conversation about the creation of a 6G task force, which I think is crucial to helping the federal government meet the policy challenges that will come with future generations of wireless technology before they create a bottleneck. Are there other things that we can do to make sure the U.S. leads the way domestically and potentially equally as important internationally?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for the question. So my colleagues have talked a little bit about the 6G issue and the legislation before you today on the 6G task force. When we talk about international activities, there's no doubt the Europeans have created a consortium, I think it's called HEXA-X, that's focused on the creation of 6G, that's bringing together European industry stakeholders from the operator and vendor community. And they don't shy away from saying that the purpose there is to make Europe the global leader on 6G technology. And meanwhile, in 2019, China came forward with an announcement saying that they wanted to start an R&D initiative on 6G. And at the time, some people thought that was really hyperbole and that it was too early. But nobody, I think, is questioning that now. And while we do want industry to take leadership on these issues, I think having a coordinated public-private partnership effort that puts the U.S. in the game on 6G institutionally would be a good thing to do.
Thank you for that. Mr. Boswell, for trusted suppliers, how do we leverage our international allies to ensure a diverse global market of trusted suppliers?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please? It was a little hard to hear.
And I'll try to even say it more succinctly. How do we leverage our international allies to ensure a diverse global market of trusted suppliers?
It's important for us to work with U.S. allies and other representatives, as it is a global marketplace that we are selling into in a global economy, as well as from a technology perspective. As we build out technology, it really, the scale that's involved there and the need to protect critical infrastructure is something that we are all facing. It's a global security issue, not just a domestic one. So we do have to continue to advance the adoption of different guidelines that enhance the protection of end users as well as the privacy of end users by deploying networks that rely on secure and trusted suppliers and a trusted supply chain, not just individual technologies or specific architecture type. Being first in 5G for the U.S. is not only an economic award that we're striving for, it's also a meaningful step forward in national security. We must continue on that path with our allies.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I am going to try to stay on your good side and yield back a whole batch of time.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the recognition. And my first question is for Mr. Boswell. In our last hearing in April, we discussed concept of Open RAN, and we heard from witnesses about the challenge of integrating certain network components into their networks, particularly for smaller providers. So my question is, what steps is Ericsson taking to work with small providers, and what role, if any, should Congress have in facilitating the deployment of Open RAN compatible technologies?
Well, small providers make up really the backbone of everything throughout the country. It's not just 3, 4, 5 big carriers, right? It's everybody working together to build that connected network. Ericsson's had a long history in this space. We serve over 150 rural and regional carriers across much of the U.S. 80% of our customers in that space have been with us for over 10 years. So we have worked with them through that transition from 2G to 3G to 4G. Some of them are just now getting to 4G and rolling out LTE. So moving towards 5G is a big deal for them.
What role should Congress have in this?
Well, it's important to reinforce what groups like the CISRIC are able to do. We recently, in some work in this most recent CISRIC, in Working Group 2, provided guidance specifically aimed at some of those smaller carriers that are going through a transition from 4G to 5G on what some best security practices are.
Well, I do have a second question. I just want to make sure I get the mic. So, and it's kind of what our Republican leader asked, so maybe you can answer here or provide her information as she asks, I guess. But HR 432, which is the Open Outreach Act, which creates the office at NTIA to provide technical assistance to small networks. So my question for you, and then Mr. Shahari, if you'll comment as well. So first for Mr. Boswell, what guidance would you give to NTIA if it were to establish such a program? And are there any changes to the scope of the legislation that may make the program more successful?
Well, yes, I think so. There are pros and cons to any technology that we're trying to implement. In particular, when we're talking about critical infrastructure where we really have to get it right all of the time. There could be increased complexities or life cycle challenges or even security issues that some of the smaller operators maybe aren't considering or aware of. So I am concerned that as it currently stands in the language, the bill focuses mainly on the benefits of Open RAN, of which there are many. While Ericsson recognizes that these small providers may need more assistance than some of the larger carriers, government policy should really be technology neutral and not focused on any one specific network technology type or architecture type. Each particular provider should decide which technology is best for them without influence from the government, but with also the right amount of input and information and context.
Okay, can I give Mr. Shahari? I got one more question after this I want to make sure I get to. So Mr. Shahari?
Yeah, on the operator education, I would tell NTI a few things. First of all, to lift up the stories of an operator like Inland Cellular in Northwest Idaho and Washington. I think that's already deploying it. I would introduce them to operators around the world that are deploying Open RAN overseas already. I would introduce them to systems integrators, including American companies who are leading the way in Open RAN network deployments around the world. I would do more things like the FCC Operator Showcase that they're holding in 2 weeks. I would consider maybe pairing it with the C-Script program that educates small operators on untrusted vendors and getting that equipment out and combine those programs. I think there's a lot they could do.
All right, thanks. I want to get one more question, hopefully time for an answer. So now that Congress, Mr. Boswell, has appropriated funding for Secure and Trusted Networks reimbursement program, small and rural carriers are hard at work preparing to rip and replace untrusted gear from their networks. But to keep these networks running, it's more of a rip than replace, more replace than rip. We've heard some about concerns for potential delays caused by permitting processes. I have HR 1053 to help the permitting process speed up by replacing equipment that poses a national security threat. Mr. Boswell, would streamlining modifications of existing infrastructure help promote the deployment of 5G and secure our networks?
Yes.
That's an easy answer. I could have waited for 3 seconds.
It absolutely would. No, there's many factors to consider there, but truly we have to maintain the pace and not forestall deployment. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
We're
and
having
we need to
so
keep
it's
that moving
permitted,
forward.
it's already permitted, we're just replacing the equipment, and so going through the permitting process.
In some cases, that can add an additional 90 days to an application process. In a lot of different states, that process to review a simple antenna installation can be as arduous as a developer with a new building of an apartment complex.
Right.
So we need some common sense to apply there.
Gentleman's time
Thank you,
has
Mr. Chair.
expired. Chair recognizes Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I wanted to start with Mr. Srihari. As you know, Congress has already been very active in supporting ways to make our wireless infrastructure and its supply chain more secure through the Secure and Trusted Networks Act and the USA Telecommunications Act, which still needs funding. But in your written testimony, you note that open architectures could reduce the global grip of Chinese firms on the market and provide other advantages to both large and small providers. Could you explain what some of those advantages might be, if you will?
Sure, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I would begin with greater flexibility. You avoid the problem of vendor lock-in if you're an operator, especially a small operator, from being locked into one particular vendor. You also get more flexibility in terms of where you house network functions, out on the edge, on the towers, or in the core of your network. Also lower costs. We've seen evidence that Open RAN deployments can be more cost-effective than traditional deployments. They also permit gradual upgradability over time, software-based upgrading rather than hardware rip and replacements that can lower costs. New innovation, new technology through artificial intelligence and machine learning to do things like automated threat detection, stronger security, energy efficiency. There are a number of these kind of technical benefits as we think about networks not just as a box that you deploy every 10 years, but switching to a software virtualized ecosystem that's going through a cycle of continuous improvement and continuous development.
All right, thanks. Let me go to Mr. Boswell. You refer in your testimony to Ericsson's ongoing work in the FCC CISRIC, and that Ericsson has been engaged across several working groups in the most recent iteration of CISRIC focused on the 5G security. And one of the bills we're considering today would make CISRIC permanent. So do you have a view on why making CISRIC permanent could be good for industry and good for the country as a whole?
Yes, I do. And actually, I have two comments. First, I would like to address Mr. Srihari's comments about some of the benefits there and just add some clarification that many of those benefits listed are not unique to an open RAN or even open system architecture. 3GPP has long been an open and interoperable system. And furthermore, from a software development, software upgradability standpoint, when Ericsson rolled out radios, there are tens of thousands of radios across the US as long as 5 years ago. Those have been upgradable to 5G with over-the-air software updates since we put them in. So much of that is not unique. My time on CISRIC has been very well spent and very enjoyed, in particular with gentlemen like Farouk at Qualcomm. I very much enjoyed working with him in the past. I have firsthand knowledge of the importance of the work that CISRIC does. And this bill that you talked about, it recognizes the significance of that task. And in some cases, it's bleeding edge or cutting edge things that we're doing for new roles like network slicing or 5G standalone networks or how to enhance E911. And those are great. That's new best practices for cutting edge things. But we also, as I mentioned before, we've taken a look at things like, well, how can we help smaller operators that are transitioning from 4G to 5G? This is a big leap. It's a completely different kind of architecture. It's a software-based infrastructure. For many of them, it's just a brand new world. And so one of the working groups, specifically this past CISRIC, looked at how to secure that transition to keep them secure throughout that process. So we really look at both ends of it. I think it's very important to to formally codify and recognize the work that CISRIC does.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Brenner, you write in your testimony about the emergency broadband benefit, which will provide discounted connectivity and equipment to about 3 million low-income households, and the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which provides devices and connectivity to millions of K through 12 students. And I'm very proud of that work. But in light of what I hope will be millions of devices getting to kids and families across the country very shortly, can you explain why it's important to make sure that those devices come from trusted vendors, and describe how the government industry can work together to make that happen, to ensure that?
Sure, thanks very much for the question, and I'm very excited about both the ECF and the EBB programs, and in addition to giving a shout out to this subcommittee for the programs, Acting Chair Jessica Rosenworcel over at the FCC has done a tremendous job that not only meeting the deadlines, but forging bipartisan consensus on the rules for both of the programs, and then having this hugely successful rollout. The short answer to your question, Chairman Pallone, is devices that have a Qualcomm chip inside, whether it's in this case, a laptop, a tablet, a fixed wireless device, a modem, or a router. We spend a fortune to ensure that our devices that have our chip inside are secure, are reliable, can be trusted. We work with every device manufacturer in the world to make sure of that, to constantly test. When there are issues spotted, we pounce on them immediately. So it's obviously crucial for these programs to be successful, and I think which we would like to see for sure, and hopefully for these programs even to become permanent, that the devices be absolutely reliable and secure, and I have every confidence that that's happening.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our witnesses for being here. Appreciate it. Over the past few months, we've seen rampant cyber attacks that have disrupted businesses, increased consumer costs, and threatened our national security. Cyber attacks are on the rise here in the United States, and since the pandemic, attacks have increased dramatically. In fact, a cyber attack happens every 39 seconds. Perhaps an even more shocking statistic is that 95% of cybersecurity attacks are due to human error. As cybercrime becomes a growing threat in a post-pandemic world that is becoming increasingly more digitalized, businesses and the public alike need to be prepared. That's why I introduced H.R. 4055, the American Cybersecurity Literacy Act, with multiple colleagues on this committee. This bipartisan bill would require the NTIA to establish a cyber literacy campaign to help promote understanding of how to stay safe online and prevent successful cyber attacks. This campaign will include lessons on how to identify malicious phishing emails, the need to change passwords often, and use multi-factor authentication on sensitive accounts, and highlight cyber risks posed by the use of publicly available Wi-Fi hotspots, among other issues. I believe common sense legislation like this bill that promotes cyber awareness and education are critical steps as we gear up to fight back against cybercrime. Mr. Johnson, I want to ask you, much of the legislation we're considering today is focused on cybersecurity. For example, H.R. 4046, the NTIA Policy and Cybersecurity Coordination Act, introduced by Reps. Duncan and Wild, would codify NTIA's Cybersecurity Office and require it to coordinate and develop policy regarding the cybersecurity of our communications networks. Further, H.R. 4055, introduced by myself, Rep. Eshu, Rep. Veazey, and Rep. Houlihan, would require NTIA to develop and conduct a cybersecurity literacy campaign to educate U.S. individuals and businesses about common cybersecurity risk and practices. How would these additional tools build on NTIA's existing work in cybersecurity? Is it an appropriate agency to administer these functions, and are there any additional tools we should consider?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a great question and a very important issue. I think especially following the Colonial Pipeline attack, not that that any government initiative, literacy initiative could have prevented that, but just the fact of gas price spikes and cars lined up to get gas, and for instance, in my home state in Georgia, it brought it home to voters and consumers in a way probably no other cyber attack ever has. So I think there is a greater awareness among people and businesses. NTIA certainly has, in commerce more broadly, but NTIA in particular certainly has an important role in this. As I was saying earlier, the Commerce Department, and often represented by NTIA and interagency discussions, is the only agency in government that talks about cybersecurity from the standpoint of a thriving digital economy. So, and that goes from consumers on devices to businesses and e-commerce and really throughout the economy. And so promoting economic development and business innovation is at the core of what NTIA does. So they have a value, they have a valuable perspective to add on anything that has to do with how consumers and businesses should operate. The only thing I would add is that DHS has done quite a bit of work on this as well, and so has the FTC. In my view, just to hit the drumbeat again, the core, we just need to have a coordinated full court press, I think as Representative Clark put it. NTIA should be part of that. It should not replicate, or it should not duplicate, rather, other parallel efforts, and it certainly shouldn't conflict. But NTIA, that's a lean, mean fighting machine, as Dilip mentioned. They have a lot to offer, and they have a unique perspective.
Let me ask you too. We've made strides in removing untrusted equipment in our networks, but there's a lot we need to do to secure 5G, especially with Internet of Things and software. In the wake of the ransomware attacks, SolarWinds, Colonial, we need a strategy to protect that infrastructure. What should Congress be doing to ensure we stay ahead of our adversaries when it comes to preventing those?
I addressed this in my opening testimony. I think the core thing, and the Congress has done this and should continue to do it, is promote an industry-led partnership with government. The network operators and their trusted suppliers have been doing this as a core business imperative for decades, and they are the core, they are the indispensable element of defending our country.
Thank you. I have others I'll submit, but I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Chair recognizes Mr. Vesey for 5 minutes, joining us remotely.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Obviously, security breaches are occurring more and more in the United States, and we need to make sure companies and our government are doing everything that we can to protect citizens. But it's also important to give America a better understanding of how they can properly protect themselves online. I'm proud to have my bipartisan bill, the American Cybersecurity Literacy Act, which will provide federal resources to educate constituents on how to do everything from properly identifying secure websites to knowing about the potential cyber risk of using publicly available Wi-Fi networks, ensuring that all Americans have the tools to protect themselves against harmful cyber attacks makes all of us safer in the long run. Mr. Johnson, I know you had a wide array of experience here, so I wanted to ask you, do you have a sense on where the public is in general on cybersecurity awareness?
As I've just spoke with Congressman Kinzinger, I think there's a lot more awareness after the Colonial Pipeline attack than there was before in terms of cybersecurity being a day-to-day consumer and frankly voter issue. We have a long way to go, and I think the key is to making these steps concrete. The problem with cybersecurity is it's all abstract, and if you're not a computer scientist, it's hard to understand how these ones and zeros could affect your life. So I think it's a matter of making simple cyber hygiene is a term that is often used. These simple steps like multi-factor authentication make it clear to consumers and citizens what they need to do to secure their devices and their networks, and they will learn how to do it.
So, that brings me to the next question. I want to ask you, what sort of awareness, or not awareness, but do you or anyone else on the panel for that matter, just have a sort of a basic understanding of how prepared the public is to protect themselves against cyber attacks? Are there any statistics out there that shows what percentage of Americans are actually, sufficiently prepared to truly protect themselves and understand all the risks and dangers out there? And again, anyone on the panel can answer.
I would, I'll just say, I know there are a number of polls and studies like that. I don't think there is any one single answer, but just because of the nature of the questions that would need to be asked. Maybe a different indicator that might help get us there is the role that C-suite executives and boards, their awareness and their activity on cybersecurity has dramatically increased in recent years. And so I can get you specific numbers on that, but that may be a leading indicator as to how everyday consumers are increasingly prepared. But we have a long way to go, I think, on both matters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Sure. This is Jason from Erickson. I'll comment on that. As the proud father of a 9-year-old daughter, I'm sure she would tell you that she is more than capable and deserves a cell phone and wants to be online more and more. But if she's watching, the answer is still no. It is a mutual responsibility to have an awareness of being online and knowing how to conduct business. This used to be the kinds of things that we would teach our children when we taught them how to write a check in a checkbook or have responsible fiscal duties at home. That extends into now responsible activity online. But frankly, I'm not sure that we've ever faced such a convergence of this technology opportunity that we've heard about today with potential critical impacts. So I've been in this business for several decades and was around for the Mirai botnet attack, the Target breach, of course, SolarWinds, which now has brought a lot of visibility to it. But those impacts are really measured in terms of loss of dollars and lost time and lost information. Compromise in the future is going to lead to loss of essential services or national assets or even loss of life. So it's up to companies like ours to get it right for the American people.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes my fellow Pittsburgh Pirate fan. But that only still gets you 5 minutes, Gus. You're recognized.
Hey, we never give up, and the Bucks are going to be good next year. Yeah, that's for sure.
Sure ain't happening
Almost
this year.
since its inception, there have been, I want to thank the witnesses as well, and there have been concerns about the cybersecurity and privacy risks associated with the TikTok and other Chinese-owned apps. A recent article titled "TikTok Insiders Say Social Media Company is Tightly Controlled by Chinese Parent ByteDance" highlighted stories. So it highlighted stories from former TikTok employees about China's control over the company's operations as well as information usage. These former employees mentioned that there existed a user-wide list that detailed likes and hashtag uses. Additionally, cybersecurity experts warn that TikTok's level of information collection creates risks of propaganda spreading to influence American app users, as well as potential blackmail for young users who will grow up to be America's future leaders. A foreign power with this much individualized access is a scary thing indeed, in my opinion. So, Mr. Johnson, with this backdrop in mind, approximately 41% of TikTok users are between the ages of 16 and 24. To your understanding, how knowledgeable are our young people that all their actions as TikTok users are being cataloged by China and will potentially be used against them as they mature? And I know this is a very serious issue. If you could respond, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman. I also, as a father of an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old who's a long way away from this, I'm also very concerned about that, about data collection from apps in general, but particularly TikTok for for the reasons that you've outlined. In worst case scenario, TikTok could be developing not just individualized portfolios of individual people, but an aggregate big data set of, I think, 100 million Americans that could be used for all sorts of nefarious purposes, including, I'll stay away from the intelligence capabilities, but bottom line, I'm also very worried about that, very concerned about that as well.
Thank you. These concerns from TikTok whistleblowers proves the point. We need literacy campaign to educate the public on cybersecurity risks, which should include the dangers of adversarial countries, their data collection, and intentions. So HR 4055, actually the main sponsor is my friend, Mr. Kinzinger, but I'm on there as a colleague along with others, Representative Ashew and others. But it would provide the needed public literacy by establishing a consumer-facing campaign about common steps that will improve awareness of potential risks and hacks. We can spend a lot of time and money keeping Chinese equipment out of our communications networks, but if users are unwittingly sharing information with our adversaries through their devices, we're not closing the loopholes, in my opinion. So the question again for Mr. Johnson, how will this bill, this particular bill, and I know you reviewed it, help improve the security of our networks?
And just to echo what I said to your colleague, I think the biggest value add is having that the commercial business digital economy perspective that Commerce and NTIA offers on these issues, and recognizing that there are 100 million Americans who want to use apps like this, like TikTok and others. That's a reality that we have to deal with and have to hopefully leverage in order to promote security awareness particularly among these young people.
Yeah. I want to make a point. I hope my kids are listening as well. Thank you. Now yield back the rest of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Go Bucks.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. And what an important topic we're talking about today. Something that is sort of the battlefront of the 21st century when we think about SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, JBS. We keep on seeing stories over and over, right, of breaches both in the highest levels of government and in some of the most sophisticated companies that we have in the United States. And it shows that we have to evolve. And Chairman, I want to applaud you because when I look at the list of bills today, and they're very much bipartisan. I know we find ourselves debating all these different issues, but this is something we're united on, that we have to step up our cybersecurity and that we have to protect our infrastructure from the threats primarily abroad that we're seeing. Right now, we're debating a bipartisan infrastructure package, the American Jobs Plan, and we saw a bipartisan breakthrough. And part of Building Back Better, part of the American Jobs Plan is more than just the physical infrastructure, it's the technological infrastructure. It's making sure that we're bringing certain industries back home that are critical to our national security, like telecommunications. In Central Florida, we're making microchips, and we're making semiconductors, and we know with telecommunications, there's gonna be more and more of a push to bring both that, pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment. We've always done it for defense, but some of these areas that are critical back. We also saw the president go to the G7 and to visit with our allies at NATO, followed by an anticipated meeting with President Putin. And we know Russia continues to harbor a lot of these cyber terrorists. And while we have to be aggressive on our foreign policy side, in a proportionate way, we also can do better to make sure our private sector and government is ready back at home. And that's what we're talking about here today, making sure that we're using best practices, making sure that we get notice when folks have ended up getting hacked. And I'd like to hear from Mr. Johnson. Over the last year, we've seen an unprecedented growth with RAN ecosystem, thanks to Open RAN architecture, a technology that allow us to go beyond a lot of the equipment we currently buy from China. For example, Rakuten Networks announcement in Japan of a multi-vendor Open RAN network. One of those vendors in the partnership is Airspan Networks, based in my home state of Florida. How important is it to develop and fund American-based vendors, knowing what comes with that is an increase in high-skilled jobs and the flexibility for a wireless network to adapt to the growing demands of a 5G network?
Thank you, Congressman. And another crucial question for this moment. And just full disclosure, one of my roles in private practice is I'm outside counsel for the Open RAN Policy Coalition, and Airspan as a member. And I will say that it is crucial to invest in companies like Airspan, not just American companies, but trusted suppliers. And here it is, I think that the aperture that we should be looking through is certainly U.S.-based companies with operations and facilities and jobs in the United States, but also companies that are organized and have operations in allied or partner countries. And this is something that, give to your G7 and NATO point, the scale of that market is what allows us to compete the free market democracies against authoritarian regimes. So, and I think, I'm not speaking for Airspan in particular, but my guess is they want to have a global market to sell to as well. And so leveraging the dynamism and innovation of U.S. and partner of companies based in the United States and other rule of law-based market democracies, our allies and partners, is I think the crucial competitive edge that we have in the coming decades.
Well, thank you, Mr. Johnson. We know many of these technologies we developed, right? Florida was a big part of developing the cell phone. Right here in Virginia, they helped develop the rudimentary beginnings of the internet. And yet we saw through business deals a lot of the technology start being built abroad because it was cheaper. But we see now that has set us up for vulnerabilities. And today we're taking a huge step in making sure we build back better and to secure our networks. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Johnson, for you starting out, while we understand the risk that Huawei possess to our networks and have acted to prevent its use domestically, there are other providers that could pose a risk to national security that may seek to enter the market as well. Currently, the FCC authorizes approvals for foreign-controlled companies to provide services in the U.S., but they defer to executive branch recommendations on their national security review of the transaction. As I mentioned, my bill would formalize this process while preserving the subject matter expertise of national security agencies. So, in your view, Mr. Johnson, how does NTIA's expertise with interagency policy development and coordination suit them for being a single point of contact between the interagency, the FCC, and applicants? How important is it to ensure timely review of these applications?
Thanks, Congressman. And let me just start with the caveat that there are many experts on Team Telecom law, and that is not my area of particular expertise. But I think that the policy that is developed over the past couple of years, get the timing mixed up because of the COVID time warp. But I think the executive order that came out of the Trump administration formally organizing Team Telecom and the agencies involved did help clarify roles in what had previously been a more of an opaque process. And that's essentially what this bill does. It codifies that executive order. Right. And to answer your question about NTIA, and I think they are, NTIA and the Commerce Department more broadly and I know this from being, from previously working in the Commerce Department on these issues. They're a crucial part of the process because, as I've said a couple of times today, they're the only agency whose core mission is promoting American business and innovation. So, which underlies American strength and security. So you have the other security agencies who also have obviously a crucial role to play in Team Telecom as well. They're coming at it from a purely security-oriented angle, and what Commerce adds to it is understanding the digital economy and the telecommunications economy.
Okay, well, thank you. For all of our witnesses, I'm also pleased to be a co-lead on H.R. 4045, the Future Networks Act, along with my colleague Chairman Doyle. As you've heard, this legislation would create a 6G task force at the FCC to examine private sector efforts regarding the development of 6G standards. If you were a member of this task force, just very quickly, each of you, what advice would you have for Congress as we review this work? Starting with Mr. Srihari.
Well, it's time to get started. The Chinese are doing it.
Yeah.
The Europeans are doing it. So I think you take the approach that we want industry to lead, but we have to start looking at, early on, what are the new technology needs going to be? What are the use cases going to be? How can we leverage what American companies are already doing in terms of global standards participation?
Okay, Mr. Boswell.
I mentioned earlier about the work that Ericsson's been doing with the National Science Foundation's RINGS program, which we're a founding member of, as well as the Platform for Advanced Wireless Research. So we have gotten started here, but it's also important to make sure that we don't leave out the academia segment here. America's universities can provide a lot of input. We have current partnerships that we have in place with the WIN Lab at Rutgers, for example, with MIT, UC Berkeley, Stanford, NYU. I could list dozens more, but the university tie-in with some of these different efforts really allows them to, A, tap into some government funding, and then B, also work with some of the industry experts that are actually out there building the networks. It creates a good cohesion and builds up our workforce in a place where we desperately need it.
Okay, Mr. Brenner.
So the private sector, led by Qualcomm, the American champion, we're going to invent 6G. We're going to drive the 6G technology, but where the government on the task force can come in is, A, we're going to have to identify and free up spectrum for 6G. That is always a multi-year effort, number one. And number two, we're going to need to put these cell sites in places, and so the task force can work through site issues. And by the way, for Mr. Soto, Airspan, fantastic partner of Qualcomm's. We make the chips for their small cells.
Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Don't have much to add to my colleagues here, but I think that is the role of government, and therefore the role of Congress setting that up, is to corral and harness this innovation that is taking place at private sector, in the private sector, and as Mr. Boswell mentioned, in universities.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but I do have some additional questions that I'll submit to the record.
You can submit them, yes. Thank you. Let's see. Next up is Mr. O'Halloran joining us remotely. Tom, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Latta, for this opportunity. First of all, I've been listening to this for a while now, and I keep hearing things like, well, the pipeline issue brought this cybersecurity issue to a new level. This has been at a high level for as long as I can remember. We've been talking about security for businesses, for our Defense Department, and to get these networks up and going. And here we are running behind others to get this addressed. It's just amazing to me. And I know our chairman and our ranking member are trying as hard as they can. Securing America's network technology is an important national security priority. I'm glad this subcommittee remains focused on this issue. When it comes to expanding our networks, we have a lot of work to do, especially in rural areas and on tribal lands. In my district, many households have no at-home internet access. This results in poorer health and educational opportunities for these families. And we have miles and miles of dead zones where our cell phones read no service. This is a problem when my constituents need to contact medical help or emergency services in remote areas. We need to expand our network capabilities and those of the digital divide, and we must ensure that these networks are secure. This is not just a problem for large tech companies. Any hole in the network security can be exploited by hostile actors. That is why last week I joined a bipartisan group to introduce the Open RAN Outreach Act. Our bill directs NTIA to provide outreach and assistance to small network providers to educate them on how to secure their networks using open network technology. By helping small providers find their components from trusted vendors, we can help secure the entire network. Small network providers, especially those in rural areas, cannot be left behind. Mr. Sahari, you mentioned in your testimony the importance of raising awareness of Open RAN among rural operations. What steps would you like to see Congress take to make sure that rural areas aren't left behind in the network security?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. One of the ironies of the rollout of Open RAN around the world is that rural and smaller operators are in some ways actually leading the charge. We see this largely outside the United States, smaller unserved areas with new greenfield deployments where there is no service before. You see operators coming in and doing Open RAN implementations, and we see results with significantly lower costs and better performance in these areas. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's just a question of making sure that small and rural operators know what's available to them today. There are American systems integrators who will bring the hardware and software together for them to make sure that they know what's available. There is, at least one operator in the United States, a small operator that's already doing it, and a larger US company is announcing plans for a nationwide network as well. I think it's just a question of making sure that these operators are connected with the information that they need, and I think the legislation would go a long way towards doing that.
Thank you. Mr. Brenner, how is Qualcomm supporting open network standards, and how would it help speed the development of 5G in rural America?
Oh, thanks very much for that question, Congressman. We are absolutely pushing as hard as possible to develop chips that will go right into the equipment that will make Open RAN go. We are working in every conceivable standards body to push for standardization of Open RAN. As I said in my testimony just a couple days ago, we announced a new the world's first 5G small cell Open RAN platform that has the latest 5G technology in it. We are working with everyone, and we think it's a great technology. And I also want to put a plug in for our fixed wireless technology. So while it's true, we need
Mr. Brenner, I'm sorry. I only have 15 seconds.
Okay,
I want to make a quick statement. No, not your fault. I don't want America to be behind other countries. Yeah.
Right.
And we have to do a process here that gets us further ahead, not just catching up. We need to get this done. And so I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. I come in here thinking I'm starting to understand everything about what we're talking about. Then I realize after listening to you, I got to keep working. This year, the FCC announced its intent to recharter CISRIC to provide recommendations to the FCC regarding ways the FCC can strive for security, reliability, and interoperability of our nation's communication systems. Last week, Representative Slotkin, Schrader, and I introduced H.R. 4067, the Communications Security Advisor Act of 2021, which would simply make the council permanent. Mr. Johnson, what's the best way to structure the council and define its focus, assisting the FCC as much as possible? And Mr. Boswell, I'll ask you to follow up on that.
Great. Thank you, Congressman, and appreciate your focus on CISRIC. I have to say, there's a special place in my heart for the CISRIC, despite its being possibly the worst acronym in a town of bad acronyms. CISRIC is it's really one of the crown jewels of our government, I think. And for those who don't know, it's the Communication Security Reliability Interoperability Council that advises the FCC. It's a collection of experts from industry, from government, and really throughout the ecosystem to make sure that our 911 systems work well, that emergency alerts, that cutting-edge issues like 5G security, and I know both companies that are represented here today have advanced that significantly in recent years. I look forward to what this next CISRIC is going to do, focused on 5G issues. I think the best way, and I do think there would be some value in statutorily backing up CISRIC. I think and don't have any particular suggestions for revising your bill. I think it could really provide a long-term backing to a committee or a council that adds tremendous value. And the only thing I would advise is to make sure that it remains flexible in terms of how each FCC puts it together. Because, for instance, there's with the two attacks that have been so high profile in the past couple of months, there are elements of each of those attacks that might be grappled with in CISRIC, and I think the flexibility is valuable.
Okay. Flexibility, Mr. Boswell?
I think from a U.S. perspective, we have an obligation, a responsibility to the rest of the world to continue leading in 5G. CISRIC is one of the bodies that helps us do that. And by codifying it and showing the support behind it, I think it supports that on a global stage as well. I've been involved in several CISRICs myself, and usually not too long after our reports get published, then I have colleagues from around the world that end up referencing those reports. Well, the U.S. says that this is best practice. The U.S. says that this is best practice because they know we have the most secure and most reliable networks right here in the U.S. Okay. So this puts kind of the pen to paper from the engineering standpoint of saying this is truly best practice because this is what U.S. operators do. I think that's very important.
Do you think, Mr. Boswell, that recommendations of CISRIC should be mandatory, or should each company identify how best to incorporate their recommendations?
I think that each company should identify how to best incorporate those recommendations, and we do take that into account as we work through each CISRIC on what's a best practice and what is this is a must-have. There are certain recommendations in every CISRIC report that kind of stipulate, well, this is for good security, you really have to do these certain things. For others, it's really dependent. Our operators have a good track record of taking a risk-based approach to the different layers that make up their network, and what makes sense in one region or architecture type may not necessarily make sense and even be a burden on them if forced to implement certain things.
Okay. Mr. Brenner, I have a question asked of you, but in the time here and with my chairman sitting behind me, I'm going to have to direct it to you and get an answer to follow up.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Ms. Rice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shrihari, you started your comments by talking about NTIA and the FCC and their need to be able to execute all their additional functions. What kind of an investment are we talking about from a monetary perspective? We can sit up here and say, this is what all of these different agencies are now tasked to do. But if we don't give them the resources to actually carry out those responsibilities, it's all for naught. So if you could just kind of is it a dollar figure or human capacity, what would you say?
So 6 of the 9 bills today, I think, would do something to NTIA or add some functions to NTIA. Most of them, I believe, would come under the budget category of the umbrella category of domestic and international programs at NTIA. As of FY 2020, there were 27 people who worked in that division. I think last year it went up into the 30s. I think President Biden is proposing to take it to 52. So this is not a very large agency here. The whole agency, I think, is about 150 employees. I think the budget proposal this year is to add another $4 million, $5 million. And this is an agency that also does federal spectrum transfers that yield the government $100 billion. I mean, there's literally 10,000 times payoff for the federal government with this agency. So I think if this subcommittee rightfully is going to bolster NTIA's functions here, I think you need to be cheerleaders for the agency in very modest budget increases to just help them do these things. Right now, I am working with them on a number of different issues, and I see the same staffers' email being CC'd on 3 very different topics because they just don't have the people right now. That's the reality right now.
Yeah, well, thank you for highlighting that. Mr. Boswell, you mentioned in your opening remarks that Ericsson, even before the pandemic, put in place very tight controls on supply chains, and that set you up well. Can you just explain, because obviously that is something that we as a Congress have to address, that our entire supply chain system just broke down under this pandemic. And we were left, states were left playing Hunger Games to try to get PPE, et cetera. So can you just enlighten us, as to how you put those controls in place?
Sure. So really, when we talk about solutions or building a network, there's kind of 2 categories. There's the hardware and the software side of it. Now, everyone says, well, all of the networks of the future, it's all software, but there's still hardware somewhere. It's not just sitting out there in space, right? So the hardware part is still very important. We build that hardware on top of a trusted chipset where certificates, attestability and authenticity verification gets loaded at the factory level, at the chipset, so that we know it's a legitimate component that's out there in the field. That also allows us to, as there's software that's built on top of that, one level attest to and kind of certifies or verifies the level above it. That's on the hardware side. Software, it's really about good process, good software assurance. We've been best in class in this for a long time. Some of the recent legislation proposals that we've seen around software assurance are kind of heading other parts of the industry in the right direction there. But it's about doing things at each layer of it, not just saying I've got a bill of materials or I've got a secure coding practice or I've got secure rollout. It's all of those processes. So we have an end-to-end framework that starts with the developers, of course. They're the ones that write the code, but that goes all the way through until we're out there in the field, literally with a field tech on the side of a tower connected to a baseband radio. They're still installing software there. So our processes cover that end to end from the moment it's on somebody's keyboard to the moment that it's up in a tower.
Thank you, Mr. Boswell. Mr. Johnson, you mentioned before the issue of territoriality. Some could accuse the way Congress is set up, these committees, there's too many committees that have too much jurisdiction over too many federal agencies, and that really reduces the efficiency of those agencies. How can we make everyone work together better? I mean, I know we learned a lot after 9/11, but this pandemic exposed that there are still those inefficiencies within these agencies. What is your best piece of advice for us to take going forward?
As a former committee staffer on the Senate side, I don't have any answers for the congressional side of the jurisdiction. I'll let y'all work that out. But with regard to oversight and the executive branch, including independent regulatory agencies, I think simply demanding that they are working together and that they are part of the same team as every committee's focus and oversight will help make it happen. I also think it has happened through the pandemic because you had a lot of dedicated public servants working with a lot of companies to keep us connected. And the FCC had a role, DHS had a role, and we're better than we were a year ago.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boswell, that's a great goatee. I don't know who wears it better, you, me, or Gus Bilirakis. It's been a long hearing. I appreciate the levity there. I want to thank most of you for your opening statements where you show some sort of support for H.R. 4046, a bipartisan NTIA policy and Cybersecurity Coordination Act that we've introduced with Ms. Wild and Mr. Curtis. Small communications providers are a critical part of securing the domestic supply chain. That's why in the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act, Congress took a bipartisan action to help smaller carriers remove untrusted equipment. And we talked about that. I think Steve Scalise was big on that earlier, including by instructing NTIA to implement a program to guide small and rural providers when it comes to making better investments in equipment and services. This program, entitled Communication Supply Chain Risk Information Partnership, I think was established last summer. To your knowledge, has this program been successful? Any of you, all of you? Mr. Boswell, you can start.
I'm not sure I could speak to the specific program that you're asking about. In regards to 4046, the current bill, I do think it makes sense to have an office at NTIA that is dedicated to these kinds of issues. We're particularly happy to see that this requires that an associate administrator would focus on market-based policies and promote innovation, competition, consumer access, digital inclusion, and economic growth. I think we would all agree those are good things. But all of that's consistent with the technology-neutral approach that Ericsson has long supported. We're very supportive of the bill.
Awesome.
I think they're just getting started with the C-Script program, from what I've heard. I think they're planning on having some workshops in the near future. I don't know that they've actually started the engagement yet. This was set up by Section 8 of the Secure Networks Act. But I do think the Policy Coordination Office that your bill does, that's the office that would be handling this program.
That, right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Mr. Brenner?
Yeah, I have the same understanding as Mr. Srihari that this is in a early stage. It's being rolled out. You know, the only other thing I want to say is harken back to something that Mr. Srihari said earlier, which is, you know, so spanning the prior administration and this one, you know, NTIA's had a lot of change in its leadership, and we don't have a permanent leader right now. And you have all these bills, 6 of the 9 bills that make all these changes to NTIA. Some are minimal, write a report. Others, you know, changing the focus of an office and turning NTIA into having cyber as one of its core functions. That's a very significant change. And it's going to require, you know, a permanent administrator to roll it out. And it would be good to get that person's views, I think, before Congress, you know, before the legislation like that is signed into law.
Mr. Johnson.
And I'll just mention that the present director of OPAD, the office here, is actually the acting administrator of NTIA, Evelyn Romali. If she's a good friend to many of us, she's an American treasure, I think, doing a great job with a small group of experts. And so I think colleagues are correct. The C-Scripts program is just getting started, but I know from experience it can have a big impact. A predecessor of it was what was referred to as a rural roadshow. In the past couple of years before the pandemic, DHS, NTIA, ODNI, and a number of other agencies went around the country to different rural-focused, small telco-focused supply chain outreach. And in many ways, I think it helped pave the path to the rip and replace proceeding or transition, I should say. And so the same people that were working on that for NTIA will be developing this program, and they hit way above their weight. It's a small office, but the good news is they can do a lot of good with hitting above their weight.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, before I came to this committee, I was on Homeland, worked with Ms. Clark and Pat Meehan and some others on cybersecurity issues. I'm glad we're doing this. I appreciate your support. With that, I'll yield back 12 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now yields 5 minutes to Ms. Eshoo remotely.
Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Lada, thank you for this very important hearing today. I've been listening to the witnesses, at least 2 hours and 15 minutes. And I think that each one of you has done a superb job. To Mr. Johnson, all of your background and previous experience really shows. But I want to point out something that maybe most colleagues don't know, and that is that Mr. Johnson is the son of a former colleague, member of the House, actually a classmate of mine. We entered the Congress together, so a warm welcome to you. Mr. Johnson, in the last Congress, and it's Mr. Scalise spoke of this, we passed legislation directing the FCC to ban telecommunications carriers using federal funds to purchase equipment made by Huawei and other entities that pose a national security threat. On this particular subject relative to Huawei, I've been like a dog with a bone. I served almost a decade on the House Intelligence Committee, and going back to 2009, 2010, I've been on this issue. I'm pleased that we're making progress. So I want colleagues to know that this is not a newfound issue on my part. Now, the legislation that we passed in the last Congress left a gap because companies can still purchase equipment that poses national security threats using private funds. So Mr. Scalise and I recently introduced the Secure Equipment Act to close the gap. Our legislation prohibits the FCC from approving any equipment from Huawei and other national security threats, and this includes all privately purchased equipment. Can you just briefly tell us about how having any vulnerable equipment in our networks poses risks to the entire network?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and another really important question, and thanks for your leadership on these issues over all these years. I think it is there are many metaphors or analogies that you could use about the weakest, the weakest link in the chain, or if one part of the network is compromised, it can affect the whole network. But we'll just give two answers to that. One is that with 5G, and I think Mr. Boswell can probably speak to this in some depth, the technical architecture of 5G actually can, I think, help us address that problem just as a matter of isolating threats. But that, in my personal view, that does not sufficiently mitigate the risk of untrusted equipment, like in my opinion, Huawei and ZTE. And so if Congress has passed laws that ban Huawei and ZTE from federal procurement and from being included in Universal Service Fund subsidized networks, it does beg the question of what about its legal availability in all other areas. And so the bill that you and Mr. Scalise have put forward would close that gap, as you put it.
Great. Let me just get another question in. I worry that we're not paying enough attention to threats to 2G, 3G, and 4G networks, even though most calls and texts and mobile data, traverse these networks. There have been a lot of one-off reports. I think we need a comprehensive study on what vulnerabilities exist, what's been addressed, so that we, the policymakers, have a whole picture. Mr. Kinzinger and I have the Cybersecurity, the Understanding Cybersecurity Mobile Networks Act that requires the NTIA to study the issue. As an expert, do you think that we're appropriately concerned about risks in the older networks?
That's a great question, and the good news is there has been a lot of work done on that through CISRIC, on those issues through CISRIC at DHS. I think you're right that the focus in the past couple of years has been forward-looking to 5G and the transition to 4G from 4G to 5G. But you're right; these 3G and 4G networks, and in some cases even 2G, will be there for a while, and it could add some value to have a holistic look at those existing networks.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now
Thank you.
recognizes
Thank you,
Mr.
Deb, for
Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, we talked about the cyber attacks a lot today. I want to go back to those. With the attacks, it's important to understand if our federal policies are effective and if the federal roles and responsibilities are sufficiently coordinated. How do you see policies like the NTIA policy and Cybersecurity Coordination Act better preparing us for these types of threats to our national security and boosting our influence abroad?
Thank you, Congressman. I do think what a bill like that would do is help galvanize the real advances that have been made in recent years. And including advances that have happened on the battlefield, so to speak, during the pandemic and through these recent high-profile attacks.
Another question, the Open RAN Alliance is an important step to establishing a global set of standards for governments and telecommunication providers to follow as we work to secure our networks from the Chinese influence. How many O-RAN networks are currently deployed in the United States, and what additional steps does the United States need to take to strengthen the O-RAN standards to increase adoption domestically?
I think, and thank you for that question as well. And as I mentioned earlier, I serve as outside counsel to the Open RAN Policy Coalition, which is sort of the policy counterpart to the O-RAN Alliance technical specifications work. DISH has announced that it is building a national network based on Open RAN. As Mr. Srihari mentioned, there is a small provider, Inland Cellular, that has an Open RAN network right now. But I think the way I would characterize it is we, the United States and also the world, are at an inflection point in developing and deploying Open RAN solutions. In my view, the role of the government here is to do what it has been doing in promoting awareness, facilitating industry's innovation, and because the progress toward open networks in general and Open RAN in particular is happening, and I think that's the role of the government is to help facilitate that.
Good. How can we work with our international partners to export this innovation and encourage our trusted vendors abroad?
That's a very important question, and just to restate something I said earlier, I think the core of this is making clear that U.S. policy and U.S. national interests are shared among U.S. allies and partners, and so there is critically, there's always a critical need for U.S.-based manufacturing and U.S. jobs, and also there's a core interest in trusted suppliers who are based in allies and partners, and also the ability for U.S.-based companies to export to those.
I wish I could give you more time. I'm going to keep moving on. Mr. Brenner, Mr. Boswell, your two companies are the largest 5G equipment manufacturers worldwide. Based on your industry experience, how do you anticipate China would respond to a policy like the Secure Equipment Act becoming law? Mr. Brenner first.
Well, so I want to be clear on one thing, which I don't think has been brought out yet, which is, in parallel with your legislation, 2 weeks ago, the FCC issued the notice of proposed rulemaking that the legislation would require. So, Congress, of course, is fully within their prerogatives to adopt the law, but the FCC is moving forward. Your bill would set a 1-year deadline. FCC notices of proposed rulemakings don't have a deadline like that, but they are moving ahead. As to how China writ large would react, the only thing I can say about that is, China is extraordinarily important to Qualcomm. We're an American company. Every time someone in China buys a cell phone, with a Qualcomm chip inside. That's real life American leadership, and that's happening very, very much.
I'm going to give Mr. Boswell a chance to respond. I do want to point out, though, that with congressional action means it can't be changed.
Right.
Right. So, Mr. Boswell.
Well, I certainly can't speak for any government, foreign or domestic, and especially not the Chinese government on what their prerogative would be, but from an outside layman's perspective, I would guess they may not be happy. But I'm not a diplomat. I'm an engineer. I build networks. I secure networks. That's what our mission is at Ericsson. So I will stick to that in my lane.
And unfortunately, we're out of time, so we're going to have to rest on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes. She's joining us remotely.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this wonderful hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for providing their expertise. I joined with Congressman McCall to introduce the CHIPS Act, which will help address the semiconductor shortage by increasing American manufacturing capacity. And I included the CHIPS Act as an amendment to last year's NDAA and recently met with President Biden and National Security Advisor Sullivan about the urgent need to fund the programs authorized by this bill. Now, given the meteoric rise of Chinese semiconductor manufacturing, I believe fully funding the semiconductor programs and the NDAA should be a top national security priority for this Congress. The Chinese are making significant investments, and the United States cannot afford to fall behind. Mr. Brenner, is Qualcomm supportive of fully funding the CHIPS Act, and how would the bill help reestablish American leadership in this crucial 21st century supply chain? Mr. Brenner?
Mr. Brenner, is your microphone on?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that question, Congresswoman Matsui. Qualcomm wholeheartedly supports the $52 billion in the CHIPS Act. And it's important to note that I think there's a lot of focus just on fabs for chips, on funding for that. But to build a domestic supply chain requires fabs, assembly, testing, advanced packaging, R&D, and all of that requires massive investment, and having the $52 billion weight of the federal government behind all of that would be a very good thing. In addition, we're not waiting for it, though. One thing we can do is actually through the standards process, we're working on supply chain security. That's another step that can be done, and Qualcomm's been a leader in that as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you. To help secure telecommunications supply chains, we must work to ensure they're as diverse and reliable as possible. As an original co-sponsor of the USA Telecommunications Act, I believe we need to fully fund the programs included in last year's defense bill to support the development and deployment of Open RAN. The Senate passed USICA appropriates $1.5 billion for the NTIA grant program and $500 million for the multilateral program. These are bipartisan figures, and I hope the House can keep pace. Mr. Srihari, do you believe the funding authorized on the bill should serve as a floor rather than a ceiling? And how could additional funding help support American leadership in Open RAN?
Congressman, absolutely. I think it should be viewed as a floor and not a ceiling. I think there is so much opportunity for the U.S. government to be supporting the development of Open RAN technologies, and not just Open RAN, open network architectures, including Open Packet, Open Transport, Open Core, and the like. I think there's a big paradigm shift, as my colleagues here have talked about, that's coming in the next few years, and the more that Congress can do, I think the faster this transition will happen.
Okay, thank you. Earlier this year, I wrote to President Biden urging him to develop a unified approach to spectrum policy, promoting cooperation and establish a clear process for resolving interagency disputes. Moving forward, it is critical that NTIA resumes its role as manager of the federal government's use of spectrum, and that agencies have transparent and consultative processes for freeing up needed spectrum. As a case in point, I recently wrote to Acting Administrator Ramali, urging NTIA to work closely with DoD to facilitate a timely auction of the 3.45 gigahertz band. Mr. Brenner, how do breakdowns in the interagency process hinder our ability to meet our spectrum goals? And what role can the Biden administration play in facilitating a more cogent spectrum strategy?
Well, thanks so much, Congresswoman Matsui. That's absolutely crucial. NTIA has that role, and they need to be given, full authority from the administration. The administration so far has put a lot of emphasis on wireline broadband, which has certainly a role, but everyone needs connectivity wherever they are, wherever they're going, and they need to do that. We need mobile connectivity, and the only way to resolve these spectrum issues is through close collaboration by NTIA as the single focal point for the federal government on the U.S. government side and the FCC.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I yield back 1 second.
Thank the gentlelady. Chairman recognizes Ms. Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this legislative hearing, and thank you to the witnesses. The Colonial Pipeline attack, which occurred due to cyber criminals gaining access to Colonial's operational technology network, reflects a fundamental paradox which has been exposed and magnified during the pandemic. On one hand, in the past year, the increased use of online services has been invaluable in retaining personal connections and continuing business operations. But on the other hand, the increased use has exposed individuals and businesses to an unprecedented variety and volume of digital threats. Mr. Johnson, can you tell how good network security and design practices can prevent cyber criminals from gaining or exploiting access to an organization's systems?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. And I think that's the best way to look at this is that the sophisticated threats that we face, particularly from nation-state actors and intelligence services, but also from criminal groups that in many cases are affiliated with those nation-states, they have the capacity to attack and affect most networks, most enterprises. And so the issue is making it harder for them and more costly for them to do so. I'm not expert on what Colonial Pipeline, how they were prepared, but I'll just say I think that all of industry in most sectors need to step up their game. And just go back to what I opened with, and I think this is really important. The communications and IT sectors, that are the subject of your jurisdiction, their private interest in network security, reliability, cybersecurity is essentially completely aligned with the U.S. government's interest. That's not the same in other sectors. So if their network goes down, their business goes down. And this is what they provide, secure, reliable connectivity. So I think there's a lot to learn. There's some other parallels in other sectors, like the financial sector. But there's a lot to learn from how the communications and IT sectors approach their work. And I think that there's a lot to build on there.
Okay. In Colonial's case, I know a single leaked password for an inactive account to the network allowed access to Colonial's network. So well-implemented networks and network security can block cyber criminals from accessing or alternating secure information. I'm also concerned that when people think about cybersecurity, they get overwhelmed and confused by the amount of information and different approaches to cybersecurity. And, I'm going to say I'm a little like that too. I'm not an expert. Mr. Boswell, how do you believe a cyber security literacy campaign like the one proposed in H.R. 4055 would help?
I do think it's very important to increase, as I mentioned before, about the awareness of the American people of the impact that being online can have on their lives, that it's not just potentially a lost credit card or an inconvenience, that as technology pervades more and more into our society, that impact itself could be a lot larger. when cyber criminals are looking to exploit an attack, there's usually three things they're trying to do. It's either to get money, to get information, or to disrupt service, or in some cases, all three. But those are generally their motivations. And so when we think about it from a protecting the network perspective, it's easy to fall into the trap of you just say, well, if it's money they want, if I can just make it not profitable for an attacker, then I'll be okay. Or if it's information, well, if I just protect my data while it's at rest and while it's moving across the network or while it's in storage, then I'll be okay. Or if they want to disrupt services, well, if I just build out a cloud-based architecture, redundant services, high resiliency, then I'll be okay. The truth is we have to do all of those things all of the time to have a truly resilient network. And I think that holistic view is where we could increase education the most.
I'm going to get to Mr. Brennan. How do you monitor and map out the security of your supply chain, given your significance to the mobile industry? And I don't have a lot of time, so.
Yeah, constantly requires constant efforts because, it means the whole chain from beginning to end. So we have a team of people that works on our supply chain that are constantly, monitoring and making, taking every conceivable step to make sure that our supply chain is secure, and I'm very happy to say that it is.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Seeing no more Democrats, Mr. Joyce is waving on, and we're pleased to have him here in the committee, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, for allowing me to wave on to today's Communication and Technology Subcommittee hearing. And to our witnesses for a long morning, thank you, Mr. Srihari, Mr. Boswell, Mr. Brenner, Mr. Johnson, for being with us on this incredibly important discussion. Today's conversation has been insightful. It is clear that we must empower the private sector to innovate at a rate necessary to stay ahead of cyber threats. The federal government must partner with these innovators to ensure that our nation's networks and that our data are secure. The human element is critical to this discussion as well. Efforts like those envisioned in H.R. 4055 and existing efforts by the private sector to increase cyber literacy and cyber awareness are also critical in defending our systems. In fact, within my district, Gettysburg College and cybersecurity company Fortinet established a partnership to modernize campus cybersecurity, defending the network from nefarious actors. This partnership could serve as a potential model for cybersecurity throughout our country's ecosystem. Cybersecurity needs to be present in all areas, in education, in business, in energy, in healthcare, in communications, and in national defense. Mr. Johnson, do you believe that we need to extend an all-of-the-above approach with strong public-private partnerships that innovate cyber solutions and make a cyber-aware population?
Absolutely, it's crucial to our future. It needs to, I like your all of the above. It needs to be a coordinated full-court press.
Mr. Brenner, do you see additional possibilities in this all-of-above approach? Do you see additional opportunities specifically in public-private partnerships?
Absolutely. I mean, we all the time engage with governments all in the United States and all over the world, and we're always open to that kind of thing.
Mr. Boswell, can you add to this conversation?
Yes, we were talking earlier about some of the early 6G work that's going on with the National Science Foundation and POWER, which, forgive me, is the Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research program. One of the things they're working on is working with industry experts like Ericsson and Qualcomm and many others, as well as government agencies, so tie-ins from the NSF, from DoD, from other spaces, but then the academic spaces as well. So they're working with NYU, Rutgers, Columbia, Salt Lake City, Utah, University of Utah and Rice, NCSU, Mississippi State, Purdue, Iowa State. Sorry if I left out a university. There's a lot of them that this group is working with. And I think that's really important, not only to make it that it's not just a conversation between those of us that have done this for a few decades on the policy side, on the protecting national infrastructure side, on the building equipment side, but also those that are coming in the next decades. So working with these universities, we're identifying that's the next generation of the people that are going to be sitting here 20 years from now, or I don't know, maybe they'll take our seats here sooner. Who knows, But that kind of collaboration with the university system, I think, is really important to reestablishing American innovation.
Mr. Srihari, can you add to this conversation?
I think your talk about public-private partnerships is an important one. Your Gettysburg example, for example, in your district. I know the bill before us today talks about creating a national program at NTIA for cyber education, but the reality of the situation is that good cyber hygiene and best practices is about teaching kids in high school. It's about the local college working with the students, or an employer teaching its new hires the basics about good cybersecurity. It's these basic sort of private sector partnerships, maybe with the local government, the state government, the local mayor's office. That's where the first line of defense is on cybersecurity, and I think you're right to call it out.
Mr. Johnson, in the few seconds that I have left, are you aware of a model of public-private partnership that can lay the groundwork in the future of our nation's cybersecurity?
Yes, sir. I mentioned this in my opening. The CISRIC back in 2015 recommended to the FCC a model of partnership between the FCC and DHS to engage network operators in particular in a trusted, confidential partnership environment for security. In some ways, it was prescient because this is what they ended up doing during the COVID pandemic. But I think formalizing that, basically picking up those CISRIC recommendations and seeing how they apply to the present is an important model.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you,
Chair sees Mr. Cardenas is joining us remotely. Tony, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Coach. Chairman, and by the way, I am working on Senator Padilla to join us on the field. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for having this very important issue, which is unfortunately going over most Americans' heads, but it's in their hands, they're in their lives, and I hope that we can pass this critical legislation that my good colleagues on both sides of the aisle have introduced them as well. I mentioned that he's an engineer. I'm proud to be an engineer myself, but kind of made it very clear that when I went off to college, she gave me a hug and said she was very proud of me. When I told her I was going to run for office, she gave me a hug and said she'd pray for me. When I got my degree, she hugged me again and said she was very proud of me. When I got elected, she hugged me again and said she'll pray for me. So you brought back some memories from a long time ago. So on a serious note, I think it's important that we all understand how important the supply chain security is. Wireless security and innovation are very technical, and I wanted to talk about these important issues here so we can get it on the record. As part of this legislative process, I think it's critical that we have these very important issues and that we hopefully get our public, our constituents, to understand how important they are. First, it's vital to understand and identify any problems in our current systems under our increasingly digital lives. That's why bills like Rep. SU and Kinzinger's Understanding Cybersecurity of Mobile Networks Act is so critical. It gives us insight into the vulnerabilities of our networks so providers can address them. Our communications networks are built from materials and components from all over the world. It's also important to identify where these come from and that all of these components are secure. That's where the Information and Communications Technology Strategy Act comes in. Second, it's important to prepare for the future, which is why we need legislation like the Future Networks Act to make sure that while the U.S. continues to be the leader in technological innovation, we get ahead of any security issues and ensure we're doing what we can to help all Americans use new technologies to make their lives better. The third piece of the puzzle that we need to talk about more about, and what I want to focus on today, is the safety of the American people. While on a national level, we need to make sure our networks and supply chain are protected, it's in the homes and the small businesses and businesses across America that people are subject to hackers and they can do tremendous damage. We need to work together to do our part. That includes companies, government, and every single one of us. One way to play our part as citizens is by being empowered with simple, high-impact methods we can use to increase cybersecurity of our devices and networks. That's why I'm proud to support the American Cybersecurity Literacy Act. I have a question for you, Mr. Srihari. We know that technology is critical to everyday life. It's how we stay connected with loved ones, work, get an education, and among other things. It's how we get to see my grandchildren in Los Angeles when I'm in Washington, D.C. While this technology can expand our quality of life infinitely, we also know it's growing more and more complex. We need to make sure our communities have the tools to use tech safely. Can you talk about some of the common threats consumers are facing today?
Oh, sure. I mean, when we're talking about cybersecurity, you're talking about malware being installed. We're talking about phishing attacks, social engineering exploits. If you look at the statistics on this, although the numbers vary, everyone agrees that at least a majority, and some say even 80, 90% of cyber attacks are because of things as common as basic password problems or basic user error. These are not complicated technical exploits here, and the effects can be very harmful either to businesses or personally, causing billions and billions of dollars in economic damages every year. So I think at a very basic level, educating the public at large on these issues would have a huge beneficial effect for the economy overall, but also make a real difference in people's lives to prevent these kinds of problems from happening.
So literacy is something that we can all practice on a daily basis, individuals, small businesses, large businesses, et cetera.
Absolutely, and that's where it starts. And a lot of the problems that we see in very large organizations are because one individual made a mistake somewhere deep down the line, and it trickled all the way up and caused a major outage. So yes, I think you're right.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair sees that Ms. Fletcher has joined us, so we're going to recognize her for 5 minutes. She's joining us remotely.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Doyle, and thanks to you and Ranking Member Latta for holding this important hearing today, and to all of our witnesses for taking the time to testify. American businesses, consumers, and innovators and the economy will benefit if the United States maintains our leadership on 5G, 6G, and future generations of wireless networks and devices. Security of these systems is of paramount importance. We've been discussing that all morning, the cyber attacks that we've seen across a variety of sectors just this year. And in response to what my colleague, Mr. O'Halloran said, issues that we have been talking about for a long time. And it's important now for Congress to pass sound policy that will protect users and networks as the world continues to become more interconnected. So, Mr. Brenner, how will the bills that we're considering today, like the Future Networks Act, help us maintain our leadership on wireless connectivity?
Mr. Brenner, is your microphone on?
Thanks so much for the question. I'm going to repeat what I said previously because there are two key things that bill can do. One, it will start the multi-year process of working with the FCC and other parts of the government to identify the spectrum that 6G will ultimately need to be rolled out in. And it's completely great idea to start on that as early as possible. And then the second thing it can do is create a forum to work on the siting issues, because we're going to need lots of sites to put the towers on in order to ensure a universal connectivity with the next generation of wireless.
Well, thank you for that. And that is an issue that we've been focused on in my district in Houston, where, of course, we have a large effort underway across the city to have 5G connectivity, and, of course, a lot of the infrastructure pieces in place. And so this has been a real focus in our community. And I think it's important that, we help share some of those lessons that we've learned about how we can facilitate that. I want to turn to another question or two with the time I have left, but really thinking about these threats that we've been talking about today. Mr. Johnson, as you noted in your testimony, COVID really put a spotlight on the critical role that our communications networks play in our lives. We're seeing it right now as we continue to be connected here in Congress, and as people across the country are connected digitally following this difficult year. But we also know how important it is that we stay vigilant to protect these networks from cyber attacks and these unwanted intrusions by adversaries. So we've talked about this a little bit, but I would love just a sort of a summary of how the government can stay on top of these threats and vulnerabilities, while at the same time ensuring that manufacturers and others can innovate, as several people have mentioned today. But maybe if you could address that, Mr. Johnson, and then if there's any time left, Mr. Boswell or Brenner, if you wanted to add anything from the industry perspective, that would be helpful.
Great, thank you, Congresswoman. I'll try to leave some time for my colleagues here. I think the best way for the government to stay on top of these threats is to work in partnership with the companies that are addressing these threats every day. The network operators, trusted suppliers, other parts of the ecosystem. This is their core business. This is what they do, and they frankly know. And the U.S. intelligence services may know some foreign adversary intentions in different ways than the companies do. But frankly, the collective expertise and resources of the ICT industry has a much better finger on the pulse than any other institution. And so we need to leverage that expertise through partnerships that they can trust.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Yeah, if I could follow on with that, it's why I get up in the morning, right? That's why my whole team goes to work every day, is to ensure the security of Ericsson Solutions, but also the networks of our customers, and ultimately that means that it's U.S. critical infrastructure. And in some of the different groups that you've heard mentioned today, whether it's CISRIC or the INSTAC, or even some of the work that DHS has done across different supply chain task force, there's three key things that kind of come up as patterns. First is that we must secure the communications itself end to end. Secondly, we must ensure the resilience of the network. And third, we must protect the integrity of the supply chain. Those patterns come up again and again, and we worked hand in hand with different government agencies, really, to put those into best practice policies that others can follow with.
Gentlelady's time has
Thank
expired.
you so much, Mr. Boswell. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I see we have no more members for questions, so we're going to close this hearing. We want to thank the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. I see we have nothing to insert into the record, so I would remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared, and I would ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. So we want to thank all our witnesses for attending today, and with that, the committee is adjourned.